Good morning. It's great to see everybody here. I am really delighted to welcome you to the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee campus. This is a wonderful place where we've had so many really interesting and good meetings like this one. So I think you're going to enjoy this very much today. We did this, it was about a year ago, almost a year ago, when Major General Scott Gray came to us and said, you know, we really ought to do something with Ukraine and talk about it and have a session he started out here on this campus. Well, the session turned out into 4 sessions, and the 4 sessions turned out to be every 2 weeks apart. So we had some very rapid fire planning with some absolutely extraordinary speakers. And many of them are the same extraordinary speakers that we're going to be having today, but we covered so many interesting topics, starting out with a presentation from one of our faculty up in Tampa, Dr. Golfo Alexopoulos, who talked to us. She is actually the director of the Institute for, maybe get it right, Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies. And she talked a lot to get us set to start out of what have the conflicts been between Ukraine and Russia over the years. And with that, then we launched into a number of topics, beginning with military and the intelligence, going on with finance and economics of war, cybersecurity, humanitarian issues, refugees, particularly human trafficking, the food crisis, misinformation and disinformation, and topics which really are all interconnected. This was a year ago, and at that time, there was a fair amount of optimism that this actually might end and that reconstruction might begin. So here we are today, a year later. And I think the optimism has certainly waned. And we have a lot to talk about today, but we've again brought in many of the same outstanding speakers and panelists to talk to you over 4 sessions once again on topics that are, a lot of them really related, as you can see today, monetary policy and market implications. A number of those topics talk about energy markets, military support, AI and warfare, health and humanitarianism, food, famine, geopolitics, security of our nation, security of the world, and also a number of the world conflicts, as everyone has been brought into this in some way or another, and particularly with some emphasis on China. So we have a topic near the end on cybersecurity, which is a very interesting one, not only in the context of the war, but in general overall. So we are thrilled that you are here to participate, to listen, and hopefully to add commentary. These are events that I have to brag a little bit about David Kotok. Over the years, I've been here 6 years, and one of the very first things that happened, David, when I came was a meeting on finance. It was, what do we call these? Financial literacy. Thank you very much. And every year we had financial literacy thanks to David Kotok. And every year they were different. They weren't necessarily just financial literacy, but they were phenomenal. And going through David's Rolodex and picking up David's good friends and adding on with the general, here we have really David has put together an outstanding series of meetings. And so, David, we are so grateful to you for all that you do, for building this university, for allowing us to be part of it, and for having people from the University of South Florida as participants as well. So I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you, David. Thank you, Scott, General, for helping us put this together. It's going to be a terrific series. So please join us for all of them. Enjoy today, and let me introduce Major General Scott Gray.
Well, if anybody deserves a shout out, it's you. I approached Dr. Holbrook last year and I said, hey, I've got an idea. Let's see if we can, do something for the students of the community just to talk a little bit about the Ukraine and what's going on. And I think I can get us a guest speaker. We were thinking 1.5 hour session, like the doctor said. And it morphed into last year, which was absolutely a success by any way you look at it. And as soon as we finished that one up, we started thinking about this year, what could we do? So I do want to say thank you so much for your leadership, your involvement, and getting your tremendous staff involved, because we could have done it without USF, to say the least. And David, thank you for everything that you have done, working together with us to pull this together. I'm really excited about this year. I'm the president of the West Coast chapter of the Air Force Association. And the Air Force Association is the lobbying force behind the United States Air Force. They are not in the Air Force, it's retirees, folks, whatever. And they're about 80,000 folks strong. And I am the president of the local chapter of that. And so I've been able to leverage connections I have with my past military background and with the Air Force Association to bring in speakers. And the first speaker we're going to have tomorrow is General Phil Breedlove, and he kicked it off last year as our keynote. He's a former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. That was the position that General Eisenhower had in World War II. So he is the military man in charge of all military NATO forces. He is up to date. He's current. Last year, he had flown in the night before from discussions in Brussels. And I've been corresponding with him now, and he's every bit as up to speed. You've probably seen him all over Fox News and everything else, talking about the Ukraine and what's going to happen. So that's tomorrow to kick it off. Then we're going to also talk about a lot of different things. But tomorrow morning, we'll be talking about financial institutions in warfare. And that's going to be a really dynamic thing because, as you know, all NATO countries have been shipping supplies and money and everything else. There's real implications to that. So we'll head that way. Then on March 9th, it's going to be a really interesting day militarily because we're going to have Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, also here last year, but he is president and head of the Air Force Association Mitchell Institute, which is AFA's think tank, if you would. You may not realize it, but you see General Deptula on Fox News or on some news outlet at least once a week talking about balloons, talking about drones, talking about artificial intelligence, talking about, do we give airplanes to Ukraine? This is the man that's at the forefront of thinking for Air Force Association, a retired lieutenant general, as I said, and just a huge brain. He will also join us in a panel that's going to talk about artificial intelligence in war. This is cutting edge stuff, all right? So that's on March 9th. Please sign up for that one, all right? And then we started talking, David and Dr. Holbrook and I, about, when Ukraine's gone, what's next? And I kept saying China, China, China. And so we agreed, you're right. Let's finish this session up with a discussion on China. That was a year ago. And look what's happening now. Look at the expansion China is doing and everything. We're going to focus on April 21st on China, which when you take a look at these balloons that are going across, you take a look at all the expansion they're doing throughout Africa, throughout Central and South America, it's a pretty phenomenal thing. The regional power, they are the regional power, but they're now a superpower, and we need to really spend some time thinking about that. So to kick that day off, I've got a good friend, General Hawk Carlisle, who's coming in, who used to be the commander of the Pacific Air Forces. And so he was in charge of all airplanes in the Pacific region, headquartered out of Hawaii. He then moved on to become the commander of the Air Combatant Command, so he's overseeing all fighters and all bombers worldwide. And he will kick off talking about the tyranny of distance, and that's where you start looking at Taiwan. It's 100 miles from China, but it's thousands and thousands of miles from us. So how do we project power? How do we do anything if China was to make a move? So that'll be the way we're going to wrap this session up. So I urge you all, please consider joining AFA. To do that, it's pretty simple. You go to AFA, Air Force Association, afa.org, and you join, and we really appreciate any new members, to say the least. Once again, thank you all for being here. We look forward to a great couple of sessions here, to say the least. We're going to educate everybody that wants it. And once again, Doctor, thank you so much, and David, thank you. And David Kotok.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Scott. There are 5 sponsors. You can see their names. The Global Interdependent Center, which is key to organizing this series. This is the first of really 7 events, because we've paired how we're going to do it. And the university has supported us in this activity now for many years. Cumberland Advisors, our firm, RiskBridge, Bill Kennedy's firm, we've partnered to help sponsor this event. So if you enjoy the lunch, thank Bill. And if you don't enjoy the lunch, it's my fault. And the Air Force Association. So what are we doing? And we learned some things from last year. So for those who are in this audience, you know we look like a TV audience. And we see cameras in the back of the room. There are 3 cameras focused on this right now. What you don't see is all the Zoom connections. And what you don't see is 12 media outlets which are covering this meeting electronically. And there are also local ones as well. What we tried to do is blend. This is the first time we've tried it, so we'll be open to constructive criticism. But we wanted to blend military defense with economics and finance. And the rationale behind that was simply that in Europe, we have a full-blown expanding, at least Scott and I have discussed this, expanding full-blown shooting war. And worldwide, we have a financial sanctions and payments war. And the United States is the leader in the financial sanctions and payments war. And we're going to talk about that starting in about a few minutes and continue that discussion right through. The second thing I would want to say is that the Global Interdependence Center, which is not well known to some, is here. It will hold its executive committee meeting here this afternoon. And you will meet along the way its members and its leadership in this program. The Global Interdependence Center has almost 50 years of creating quietly substantive dialogue on important issues. The website is interdependence, one word, .org, and the registration for all of these events can be found on that website or other places, but interdependence.org will tell you how to sign up, which one, what you want to see. Now, I have a couple comments, but looking at the clock, I know we're on a time slot. So are we good, Cole? Are we connected to Cleveland? All right. I should thank Kelly Bush for all the organizing help that has taken place in this university. And thank Cole, because all the technology you're going to see and hear about from Loretta Mester in Cleveland. Hello, Loretta. I'll introduce you officially in about a second. To coordination of speakers from around the world is happening in this marvelous environment. So for those who are here in person, you're the TV audience. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Let me make an introduction. Now, my instruction from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland is keep it short. Loretta doesn't like long introductions. So I won't give a traditional long introduction. I'll give a personal introduction. In my experience in the Global Interdependence Center, over the years, I've been its program chairman, and I've chaired its central banking series. So I've had the experience of meeting with central bankers all over the world. Some become good friends, and if David Rubenstein can call J-Pal J when he does an interview, I can say, Loretta, you're a good friend. Loretta Mester, you can read the bios. I want to talk about Loretta Mester. I don't want to talk about the bios. I have followed and known Loretta because we have a common thread that leads to a small financial institution and education institution in Philadelphia. And her work has always been serious. When it was in the Federal Reserve System, she has a distinguished career in the Federal Reserve. As an academic, she does what she does seriously. And what I found over decades, I would say, I think that's accurate, is Loretta tells you as clearly as possible what she sees, is willing to admit if she doesn't, and digs deeply into the research before taking a position as best she can. My colleague, Bob Eisenberg, in his history, he's sitting over there, worked with Loretta when he was the director of research at the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. Loretta was the director of research at the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia. Had the privilege of knowing them both and working with them both in those days. Lastly, we're going to hear a message from Loretta, and then if we have a little time, we'll have a little Q&A. I want to say a final word. Both Loretta and Bob, in their research roles and in their leadership roles in the Federal Reserve, spent years in what the show Hamilton calls the room where it happens. And they've been in the room where it happens a lot of times. Do not expect anyone in the Federal Reserve to whisper in your ear, here's what's going to happen in the room where it happens. But what you will get is honest, direct, and transparent information and responses. And we are about to open this 7-part series with a keynote from the president of the Cleveland Fed, who has spent a number of years participating in the decisions from the room where it happens. So please welcome my friend Loretta Mester, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Loretta, it's all yours.
Well, David, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it, and I do count you among my friends. And I want to thank the University of South Florida and the Global Independence Center for inviting me to speak today. As David said, although you did age us, which I'm not sure that was very helpful, but in any case, we do go back a long year and many years. And I've had the privilege of being and attending and participating in many GIC events over the years. And you're exactly right. You just have a long tradition of organizing sessions that really inform us about what's going on, what's affecting the world's economies. And they're always timely sessions, and you always come away learning something. And I'm really happy that I've been able to participate. So, as David said, I'm going to be speaking today about the U.S. economy, the outlook for the economy, and the appropriate monetary policy settings that are going to return our economy to price stability. And of course, the views I'm going to present will be my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or my colleagues on the Federal Open Market Committee. Now, as David said, we met in Philly, and because the Super Bowl was played just this past Sunday, I titled my talk, "In It to Win It." And that's really because the Fed is committed to getting the inflation back to our 2% goal. But of course, returning the economy to price stability is not a game. It's an imperative for sustaining healthy labor markets and our standard of living. And the very high inflation the economy has experienced for almost 2 years now has been very painful for households and businesses, and especially those with fewer resources, as they've had to really cope with those increasing costs and had to make hard decisions about where to spend their money. And the organizations that offer services to lower income households have also been struggling with higher costs, which means they're limited in their ability to offer aid to as many people. Now, this high inflation also imposes longer run costs on the economy because it really distorts the decisions of households and businesses about their investment decisions in human capital, investing in R&D, plants and equipment, and other forms of physical capital. And those decisions ultimately affect the pace of innovation in our economy, productivity growth, the potential growth rate of the U.S. economy, and improvement in our living standards. So because of the negative cost of high inflation, the Fed is resolved and focused on returning to price stability in a timely way. So we are in it to win it. So last year, in the wake of very high inflation, the Fed took deliberate action to remove monetary policy accommodation. And over the course of 2022, the FOMC raised the federal funds rate, our policy rate, by 4.25 percentage points. And we began reducing the size of the Fed's balance sheet by rolling assets off. Now, at the meeting 2 weeks ago, the FOMC took another step and raised the target range of the Fed funds rate by 25 basis points. So that target range now is 4.5 to 4.75%, and the balance sheet reduction continues. Now, several factors contributed to the sharp rise in inflation. That sharp rise started in the spring of 2021 in the US, but it's also occurred in other advanced economies around the globe. So some of those factors are the pandemic and how households, businesses, and monetary and fiscal policies responded to it, and Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, an imbalance arose between strong demand and constrained supply, and that led to significant upward pressure on prices in an environment of accommodated monetary and fiscal policy. Now, the incoming economic information shows that our monetary policy actions are having the intended effect of slowing demand and reducing price pressures. In addition, supply chain disruptions are easing, which is also helping to alleviate some of the imbalance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So this is good news. But further monetary policy action is needed to ensure that inflation is on a sustainable downward path to 2%. Now, economic growth slowed considerably last year, and I expect that growth will be well under trend this year. Real GDP grew at a below trend a pace of 1% last year, down from a very robust pace of about 4.75% in 2021. Growth in the final quarter of last year was almost 3%, but much of that was due to firms rebuilding inventories. So if you abstract from inventories, growth in real final sales was a more modest 1.5%, suggesting some dampening in underlying momentum. Now, interest rate sensitive sectors have been experiencing the sharpest slowdown. Residential investment continues to decline sharply in response to higher mortgage rates. Business fixed investment and manufacturing activity have both slowed. Now, consumer spending, which makes up about 70% of GDP, has held up, reflecting the strength in household balance sheets. But it too has slowed from the robust pace seen in 2021. On the supply side of the economy, supply chain disruptions have improved, but not uniformly across sectors and products. So the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has a global supply chain pressure index that they've constructed, and that fell appreciably last year, although it remains above its pre-pandemic level. So there's still constraints on the supply side. Some of the improvement in the index last month reflects better delivery times from China, consistent with China easing its zero COVID policy and reopening its economy. And we do a lot of talking and seeking information from business contacts in our district, and they tell us that transportation bottlenecks and delivery times have improved compared to last year, but still that certain products like computer chips and electric generators remain difficult to source. Now, despite the slowdown in growth, labor market conditions remain strong, with labor demand continuing to outpace labor supply. So after some moderation over the past year, there was a sizable gain in payrolls in January, with the economy adding over 500,000 jobs that month. The number of job openings moved down somewhat over the past year, but there's still 1.9 openings per unemployed worker. and that's much higher than it was during the last expansion. The unemployment rate has been running at about 3.5% for the past year. That's a 50-year low, and it actually edged down in January. Now, despite those strong numbers, anecdotal reports from our business contacts suggest that conditions are easing in the labor market, except in healthcare, where a significant hiring challenge remains due to a national shortage of skilled and unskilled healthcare workers. Now, although they do not intend to reduce their workforces, many of our business contacts have tempered their demand for workers. And those that are hiring say it has become easier to find the workers they need. Now, on the supply side of the labor market, labor force participation has stabilized below its pre-pandemic level. And over time, it's become more apparent that this lower level of participation reflects structural factors as opposed to the stance of the business cycle. And that includes the high level of retirements over the pandemic, reduced immigration, and changes in preferences, and also the difficulty in finding affordable childcare. Now, one indication that labor demand is outpacing labor supply is strong wage growth. Now, labor costs constitute a significant share of a business's expenses, especially businesses in the service sector. The strong increase in wages has contributed to higher inflation. Yet, if you look at workers' wages, they really haven't, in general, kept up with inflation. So, in real terms, many workers are not better off. The recent data and reports from business contacts suggest that as the economy has slowed, wage growth has started to moderate from its peak last summer, but nonetheless, nominal wage growth is still around 4.5%. So how do you think about that? If you given current estimates of trend productivity growth, which is they're between 1 and 1.5%, that means that wage growth is still about 1 to 1.5 percentage points above the level consistent with price stability. So the imbalance between labor demand and supply is going to need to continue to shrink to alleviate price pressures, which then feed into price pressures. Since there's little reason to think that labor force participation is going to increase significantly in the coming months, labor demand will need to moderate further to reduce the imbalance. And I do expect that with the economy growing well below trend, the labor market will cool off with slower employment growth and a rise in the unemployment rate this year. But this moderation in labor demand could come mainly from firms deciding not to add to their payrolls rather than cutting their staffs. In fact, many contacts have told me that they plan to do all they can to retain workers through the slowdown, given how hard hiring has been over the past couple of years. So that suggests that we will likely see less of an increase in the unemployment rate than we typically see in an economic slowdown. Now let's talk about inflation. Inflation remains well above our goal of 2%. Recent monthly readings show that inflation has eased from its high point last summer, and short-term inflation expectations have moved down with it. In December, the year-over-year measure of headline PCE inflation moderated to 5% compared to 7% in June, and declining energy prices contributed to the decline in overall inflation. Underlying inflation measures have also shown some improvement. In December, core PCE inflation was about 4.5% compared to 5% in June. And if you look at the most recent 3-month period, core PCE inflation is down to 3%. The median and trend mean PCE inflation rates, there are alternative measures of the underlying inflation rate, and they exclude components with the most extreme movements each month. They have both also shown some improvement in recent months, but to a lesser extent than the core PCE inflation rate. Now, the improvement in the monthly readings in core inflation have come from the goods sector, where PCE goods prices fell about 3% annualized over the past 3 months. And some of that decline reflected an unsustainably sharp drop in used car prices. So goods inflation is likely to move up in coming months. So we should be prepared for that. Shelter price inflation has not improved, but it is expected to ease later in the year as housing activity continues to weaken and the deceleration in rents in new leases passes through to inflation measures. The last component I want to talk about is core services inflation excluding shelter. That component also has not improved. It tends to be sticky, it's correlated with wage inflation, and it has a large share in the overall index since consumers spend a larger share of their income on services than on goods. So for much of the pre-pandemic expansion, core goods inflation has been slightly negative, was slightly negative on average. With falling goods prices, they were pulling inflation down. And by the end of that expansion, inflation was nearly up to our target. In January 2020, PC inflation had reached 1.8%, and core inflation had reached 1.7%. And that reading reflected 0.75% deflation in core goods prices and 2.5% inflation in core services prices. So that's very different from today. In the current period of high inflation, which began in the spring of 2021, core goods prices have been rising. And for much of this period until recently, inflation in core goods has exceeded inflation in core services. So that means that to achieve our longer run goal of 2% inflation, we're going to need to see continued sustained disinflation in both components, goods and services. So my expectation is that we will see a meaningful improvement in inflation this year and further improvement over the following year, with inflation reaching our 2% goal in 2025. But my outlook is contingent on appropriate monetary policy. So let me turn to that. So first, in making its monetary policy decisions, the FOMC is always guided by its strong commitment to achieving its statutory goals of price stability and maximum employment. And the FOMC has come an appreciable way in bringing policy from a very accommodative stance to a restrictive one. But I do believe we have more work to do. Now, precisely how much higher the federal funds rate will need to go and for how long policy will need to remain restrictive will depend on how much inflation and inflation expectations are moving down. And that will depend on how much demand is slowing, supply challenges are being resolved, and price pressures are easing. So at this juncture, the incoming data have not changed my view that we will need to bring the Fed funds rate above 5% and hold it there for some time to be sufficiently restrictive to ensure that inflation is on a sustainable path back to 2%. Indeed, at our meeting 2 weeks ago, setting aside what financial market participants expected us to do, I saw a compelling economic case for a 50 basis point increase, which would have brought the top of the target range to 5%. Now, my view of appropriate policy is contingent on my economic outlook, which is informed by incoming data, the real-time reconnaissance provided by our regional contacts, and a variety of economic models and analyses. So the FOMC likes to say that its policy decisions are data dependent, but that doesn't mean we react to one or two data points. Instead, I view data dependent as shorthand for saying that incoming economic information informs my economic outlook and assessment of risk, which in turn informs my view of appropriate monetary policy. Now, in addition to my economic outlook, my policy views are importantly influenced by risk management considerations, including the risks to the economic outlook and my assessment of the cost of continued high inflation to households, businesses, and the longer run health of the economy. Now, it's welcome news to see some moderation in inflation readings since last summer, but the level of inflation matters, and it's still too high. January's CPI inflation report showed a jump in the monthly rate of overall inflation and no improvement in underlying inflation. The report provides a cautionary tale against concluding too soon that inflation is on a timely and sustained path back to 2%. So I continue to see the risk to the inflation forecast is tilted to the upside for a number of reasons. Russia's continuing war in Ukraine, which you're going to be talking about today, adds uncertainty to the inflation picture, particularly for food and energy prices. Now, while energy prices have moved down partly because of mild winter weather in Europe, they could move up again, as could food prices. Indeed, if you look at the January CPI, energy prices rose strongly and food prices also advanced. So these items constitute a sizable share of the consumption basket for many households, particularly those with lower incomes. And they also influence short-term inflation expectations. Another source of risk is China. On the one hand, the reopening of China is helping to ease supply chain disruptions. But China is also a major world economy, and increasing demand there will put upward pressure on commodity prices. Several private sector forecasters do not expect inflation to return to 2% until sometime next year. And according to the median in the December FOMC Summary of Economic Projections, this goal will not be reached until 2025. Now, if that comes to pass, it means that inflation will have been above 2% for over 4 years and well above 2% for much of that time. And even that forecast could turn out to be optimistic. Some recent research by economists at the Cleveland Fed presents a plausible case based on a model and historical relationships in the data that inflation could end up being much more persistent than current projections, despite the actions the FOMC has taken. Now, while that research has not altered my view that there will be material improvement in inflation this year, it does inform my view that the risks to inflation remain on the upside. The upside risk to inflation and historical experience suggest to me that the cost of undershooting on policy or prematurely loosening policy still outweigh the cost of overshooting. Under tightening raises the risk that inflation will settle in stubbornly above our goal, imposing both short-run and long-run costs on households and businesses. It could result in longer-term inflation expectations moving higher, which would make it much harder and more costly to return to price stability. Now, over-tightening also has costs, but if inflation begins to move down faster than we anticipate, we can react appropriately. So given the risks and the costs, we need to be prepared to move the Fed funds rate higher if the upside risks to inflation are realized and inflation fails to moderate as expected, or if the imbalances between demand and supply and product and labor markets persist longer than anticipated. So in summary, inflation remains too high, and it's the responsibility of the FOMC to bring it down. So the FOMC is resolute in continuing to bring monetary policy to a sufficiently restrictive stance to ensure that inflation returns to our 2% goal in a timely way. Tighter financial conditions will result in growth well below trend this year and some cooling off in labor markets, with slower economic growth and an increase in the unemployment rate from its very low level. And these developments will help to alleviate price and wage pressures. As a result, I expect to see good progress on inflation this year. Now, we're operating in an uncertain environment, and economic conditions can evolve in unexpected ways. With growth well below trend, it wouldn't take much of a negative shock to push growth into negative territory for a time. In fact, most of our business contacts are preparing for a mild recession. Similarly, inflation dynamics over this expansion have been influenced in important ways by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and we need to be very open to the idea that inflation can evolve differently than we expect. So to help me formulate my economic outlook and policy views over the year, I'm going to be looking at a variety of incoming data and collecting economic and financial information from our business, labor market, and community contacts. The transition back to price stability is going to take some time, and it will not be without some pain. There will be some bumps along the way as the economy slows, but high inflation is also very painful. So I don't view the current situation as one in which there's a trade-off between our two monetary policy goals, because returning to price stability in a timely way is the best way to ensure a healthy labor market over the longer run. So I plan to remain diligent in setting monetary policy to return the economy to price stability and to be judicious in balancing the risks so as to minimize the pain of the journey. So that ends my prepared remarks, and I'm very much looking forward to interacting with you in a Q&A session. In short, I remain in it to win it.
Thank you very much, Loretta. We have a microphone, and I'm going to ask One, if you ask a question, please make it brief so we can get the microphone around. And two, please identify yourself and don't start talking until the microphone's in your hand. And then Kelly will remove it when you're finished to get to the next person. Otherwise, you won't get a record of it. I'll ask the first question while we get ready for the microphone. Loretta, yesterday, a major commentator on a major financial channel, a person many of us know, said the Fed will have to adjust the 2% target to 3% or something even higher to avoid the slowdown pain. 2% doubles the price level in 36 years. 3% doubles the price level in 24 years, and we can do the rest of that math. Could you respond to the pressures from financial commentators about not holding 2%, but accepting 3%, and some are even saying more than 3%? What's your view on that?
No, there's no change in the target. The target is 2%. We're going to do what we have to do to bring inflation down to 2%. There's no intention of changing the target. I would not support that, and I don't see a reason to do it. We're going to be resolute in bringing inflation down. It's going to take some time, as I said. Most forecasters don't have inflation coming down to 2% at the end of this year or next year. The December SEP's, basically Summary of Economic Projections of FOMC members, had it declining to 2% in 2025. But we're resolute in doing what we have to do to bring inflation down to 2%. At the same time, we have to be mindful of both of our goals. So as we do policy, right, we're going to be judicious in bringing that inflation down. But there's no change in the goal. The goal is 2%.
Thank you. We have a question. Please identify yourself and ask your question, sir.
My name is Alex Miller. Dr. Mester, thank you for your comments. Can you speak a little bit about how you're economists and how you think about the budget deficits that we run every year and how that affects inflation and how you work that into your mathematical models? And then if you theoretically suppose we did not run a deficit, how that would affect inflation? Thank you.
Well, you're right in the sense that over the long run, we have to have a sustainable fiscal side of the economy, and that's important in the long run. In the current environment, the way we look at and do our models, it's looking at government spending and fiscal impetus from that government spending and fiscal policy. So we don't look at the deficits per se, except through the fact that, the government is a share of the GDP growth. And so we look at it, model it that way. But your point is well taken in that over the longer run, getting the fiscal budget situation balanced is going to be, in a sustainable way, is going to be an important factor in the long run health of the economy.
Thank you. Bob Eisenberg has a question. I can identify him. So I'm preparing you, Loretta, because we have no idea what's coming.
I think
Go right into the microphone.
I think I can say, Loretta, we really appreciate the depth and breadth of your remarks. I think everyone should be very comfortable that real professionals are involved in the analysis and policy making. Having said that, you touched briefly on the potential for a slowdown in the economy. The Philadelphia Fed's survey of professional forecasts, which came out in February, up on February 10th, showed that only 20% of the respondents expected negative real growth. Could you sort of say how that figures into the overall computation as to how long and how tight policy has to be? And secondly, is any thought being given to doing SEP forecasts every meeting rather than every other meeting, and perhaps on a quarterly basis rather than an annual basis?
So the first part of the question is, there's a variety of forecasts out there about GDP growth this year. Some private sector forecasters have a mild recession in their forecast, others do not. So there's going to be a span of views. I expect, growth well below trend, but I have not penciled in a recession for the year. But when you talk to business leaders, what you find out is, their views have changed, right? Earlier, they were not expecting a recession. Now, given that they've seen some pullback in demand, they're preparing for recession in the way they're thinking about their businesses and their investments, but they believe it'll be a mild one. So, when you have growth that's slowing and as slow as it perhaps will be this year, it doesn't take much to push you negative or positive. But I think majority of the forecasts don't see it being a deep recession. So that's one thing. And of course, the slowdown on the demand side is one of the things that will bring price pressures down as, right, the demand side gets into better balance with supply. Supply is also dynamic, and as the supply chain restrictions and disruptions ease, that also will help do some of the work. So that rebalancing is going on, and it shows up in various forecasters differently. And of course, the forecasts get revised over time as more information comes in. The latest data from on the retail sides, retail sales data suggests that there, is some slowing in the economy, but it's resilient. We've seen some resilience there. So that'll feed in. We'll have to see that rebalancing. We'll have to see, demand getting into better balance with supply, and that'll inform our policy decisions going forward. In terms of communications, communications is something I care dearly about in terms of our policy communications. I can't tell you specifically about what we're working on, but we're always looking to improve our communications, whether it be our summary of economic projections, our FOMC statements, our engagement with the public in various different ways, like the Fed Listen events. So this is a long-term project for us to make sure that we're communicating in a way that people understand how we're thinking about the economy, how we're thinking about monetary policy, and how the incoming information influences our views of the economy and risk.
Loretta, while the microphone moves, let me insert a question. We had 1.25 million Americans dead from COVID. 500,000 of them died while they were employed. We're about 2 million short in terms of immigrants in jobs in the labor force. You could argue 100,000 or 200,000 either way, but that's an approximate number. And we now know we have 3 million or so, maybe more, in the labor force, and the number's growing all the time from long COVID disability. And there's this huge 5 or 6 million person gap that you alluded to when you started your formal remarks. In the recent history, you've not had to confront that gap as a Federal Reserve policy decision maker. How does that change the thinking in the FOMC, and what time frame do you use to estimate that 5 or 6 million person gap will close?
Well, that's a very good question, especially for the time now, because one of the things that we've kind of learned over this process is that when we first started, when the economy reopened, the thought was we would have tight labor markets for a time, but people would return to the workforce. And what's actually happened is that return hasn't happened as quickly, or there's still a labor shortage, if you will, and labor markets are still very tight. And the summary statistic I quoted in the prepared remarks are about that openings, right? So labor demand, how many jobs are the businesses trying to fill, and how many unemployed people who aren't employed who could fill those jobs, and it's still almost 2 to 1, right? So there's a labor shortage, and you see that manifested in wages. But some of the things you're talking about, David, are not cyclical. And that's one thing we learned, is that some of this is not a cyclical phenomena, it's structural. And there will have to be, in order to, labor force growth is very important for the long run health of the economy in terms of our potential growth and our living standards and productivity growth. we're going to have to do better in terms of figuring out immigration, right? Immigration can be an important source of labor. Certainly in healthcare, that was something that really hurt that sector, and that's why they are really out of balance in terms of demand versus supply of workers. In terms of thinking about the current situation, we're going to see some slowing in that demand. We've already begun to see it. If you talk to businesses, they're not going to be hiring as many, and some of them have said, we're just going to work very hard to maintain our current staff. So again, they're starting to ease off on demand, right? Supply has moved up over the expansion. Whether it'll continue to move up, I think, is debatable. We'll have to see. So that'll help close that gap and alleviate those price pressures and alleviate wage pressures, and then that'll feed through the price measures. But you're right. I think there's a lot to understand in the labor market going forward, and those structural imbalances, and education is part of it. You're at University of South Florida, making sure we have a very educated workforce who can do the work of the future is going to be becoming even more important than it's been over the previous decade.
Thank you. Kathleen Stephenson is going to ask a question, just so the audience knows. Kathleen is Chair Emeritus of the Global Interdependence Center and current chair of the College of Central Bankers, which is an organization of former central bankers within the Global Interdependence Center. It's not widely known about it. It's a collection of wisdom and maybe some battle scars for holding positions like Loretta is holding now. Kathleen, go right into the microphone so we
Thank you, David. President Mester, Loretta, I don't know where I should look for you to see me, but I'll look.
She can't see you. That's why you just go right into the microphone.
Okay. So I want to touch on the leads and lags of monetary policy, particularly with regard to using models, and you touched on the changes, the structural changes in the economy. So the question that I have is the shift in monetary policy to date. In your assessment, how long will it take for the economy to fully absorb it? Or do you think that because of the aggressiveness of the rise in interest rate that it is already feeling it? Thank you.
So that is a good research question that there's a lot of academic and Fed economists working on. One way to look at it is that we've communicated. Remember when we started, last year, right? We had communicated well in advance of the first rate increase that we were pivoting policy. And even before that first rate increase, mortgage rates had begun to rise. So how you think about the effects, right, are going to be perhaps differently than just when we started to raise the rates because of the communication. So that's an area that people are researching. There's also research going on about, well, maybe the financial markets are more efficient at passing through. I haven't seen anything compelling that's different from the traditional. There are long and variable lags. Some parts of the economy are very interest rate sensitive and they respond very quickly. And I think we've seen that in more, the housing market and autos, and other parts it takes longer to pass through. But usually we say, maybe a year or so to before you see the full effects, but it continually passes through over time, different sectors reacting differently. In some sense, right, we are going to be looking also at indicators of what the impact is and our forecast. So that's why you have to take the incoming data, you have to use it to inform your outlook, and you have to use modeling to help tell you, is the funds rate in a restrictive stance, and is it sufficiently restrictive to get inflation down? So this is a dynamic process. It's not like we set it and let it go. We're going to have to be continually monitoring whether demand and supply are coming into better balance and price pressures are easing, which means that we're going to be very attuned to looking at that incoming information, whether it be official data statistics, whether it be survey data, whether it be our own talking right, in the districts and across the country to contacts from the communities and from businesses and from labor market leaders about what's actually happening in the economy. So I don't think I can pinpoint it. I haven't seen anything that really says to me that it's definitely faster or definitely different or definitely slower. But I do think it's a good thing to be watching and studying so that we have more informed views when we set policy.
Thank you. We have a question from Bill Kennedy. Bill Kennedy is the president of RiskBridge, one of the co-sponsors of this series, and is also the current chair of the Global Interdependence Center. Bill?
Thank you, President Mester. Thanks for your comments. We have a debt ceiling showdown coming on the calendar in the next few months. U.S. Treasury has had to take extraordinary measures to adjust for the debt ceiling. I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the impact to the Fed's quantitative tightening plan, the shrinking reduction of the Fed's balance sheet, both near term to address the impact of the debt ceiling debate, but longer term, do you anticipate any acceleration or slowdown in the reduction of the Fed's balance sheet? Thank you.
Well, first off, we have to raise the debt ceiling. This is money we've already spent as a country, so we have to pay our bills. We cannot default on our debt. That would be a huge negative impact on the economy, not just today, but for many, many years to come. I don't see that would affect anything positive in the U.S. economy. That can only be a negative. We cannot breach. We cannot default on our debt, and breaching the debt ceiling raises that possibility that we will default on the U.S. debt. In terms of how it's affecting monetary policy, we are reducing our balance sheet. We put out a plan that basically involves rolling off of our securities that we hold, our assets on our balance sheet, and that's continuing, and I expect it to continue.
Doc Berlin is a columnist, an economist, former Wall Streeter who lives in Sarasota and is a member of the Economics Club of Sarasota. He has a brief question, briefly. Doc.
Dr. Mester, first of all, thank you for your comments. My concern is that the size of the federal debt is going to limit the ability of the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, because then the ultimate interest cost associated with that will become such a significant part of the budget. Could you address that, please?
Well, fiscal policy is fiscal policy. We're focused on the mandated goals that Congress gave us of price stability and maximum employment. That's where we focus when we're setting our policy. And we're going to be very resolute in doing what we can with our policy tools, including raising interest rates as necessary to get back to 2% inflation. So we don't, mix the two. We're very focused on our policy goals, and that it's not going to deter us from doing what we have to do.
There's a question from Yorick Vasquez. I hope I pronounce it correctly. With the Wall Street Business Academy. Why don't you pick up the pace rather than reduce the pace of interest rate rises? Is there a structure in which you would accelerate the pace from the quarter point metric?
Well, we go into every meeting and we bring all the information that we have to the table and talk about where the economy is and our forecasts of where it's going and the risk around those forecasts. So it really is going to depend on the evolution of the economy over time, what we do at any particular meeting. As I said, right, I still, looking at all the data that's come in and all the analysis, I still think we're going to need to bring the Fed funds rate above 5%, right, in order to get inflation down to 2% on that path down to 2% in a timely way. But I'm very open to looking at the incoming data. And if the risks that I pointed out in the prepared remarks, the upside risk to inflation, actually manifest themselves and are realized, then we may very well have to move higher, hold it longer at that peak rate, or even change, what we do at any particular meeting in terms of the size. As I said at the last meeting we held, I saw a compelling case for keeping the 50 basis point on the table. But, policy views differ among policymakers, and that's what's the strength of the Fed, is that we have alternative views that we bring to the table, a diversity of views, and then we come up with the consensus, and that's what the committee decided to do. But it's not always going to be, 25. As we showed, when the economy calls for it, we can move faster and we can do bigger at any particular meeting. And really, it's going to be driven by how the economy is evolving. What are those developments? And is that going to get us back to price stability in a timely way?
Thank you. We have one more question. You're very gracious with your time. Scott Gray, General Gray, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for your time and patience with us here. It's been a great education. Implications of the war in Ukraine. We've spent billions of dollars, and I don't see a short-term quick fix to this, just like you're saying there's no short-term fix to this inflation. But what are the implications of those billions on inflation? And then if you take a look at no short-term fix to this, the political implications to this administration, are they going to start pulling strings and trying to do something to salvage this in the next year before the election?
When we're thinking about monetary policy, we do have to take into account fiscal policy as well. And that's part of the demand side of the economy. And, government spending, whether it be on defense or non-defense spending, is part of what we take as the environment in which we're setting monetary policy. Environment meaning it informs us about the strength of demand. So we don't affect the fiscal policy side of it, but we have to take into account where demand is. Is it slowing enough to bring demand back into supply? So that is part of the calculus when we're trying to understand where the economy is going and whether inflation is on that sustainable downward path to 2%. We are a very non-political organization. We do not set policy influenced by any political considerations. We really are guided by our congressionally mandated goals of maximum employment and price stability. And that's what's guiding our policy decisions as we go forth and evaluate where the economy is, where demand is, where supply is, and where inflation is going.
Loretta, thank you. I know you have another meeting. We're sorry you're not with us in Sarasota this time. It's only 80 degrees with sunshine here. But we'll get you back in person on another occasion. Before we just leave, let me just say a word. The Federal Reserve, ladies and gentlemen, is a convenient target for media. We hear that all the time. You can open up any media outlet and you can listen to any of 100 experts say what the Fed should do. The Fed cannot respond to all the media outlets, so they have to just let it roll like water off the back of a duck. The Fed is attacked constantly, and those attacks threaten the independence of the Central Bank of the United States. So we've had an economic discussion, we've had a policy discussion. Loretta Mester has presented to us her rationale for decisions, and you've had a window into the discussions within the Federal Open Market Committee. But you've also had a soft lesson on why the independence of the Central Bank of the United States is a critical item for every investor, every business person, every citizen, and frankly, for the entire world since the United States is the guard of the reserve currency of the world. So the soft lesson for today is the candor and explanation from a very skilled public service. Loretta, thank you for your public service, your service to our country, and for being with us today. Thank you very much.
David, as always, it was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Travel safely.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to convert this auditorium to the next panel. It'll take us 3 or 4 minutes to do it, and we'll continue the discussion. Okay, this session is on investment implications. Investment implications, responding to what you just heard from the president of the Cleveland Fed, investment implications to what we're going to talk about in all these series having to do with defense, military, prices, inflation, and hopefully it will be helpful. So I'm going to ask Patty Healy to introduce and moderate the panel, introduce your panelists, and let's go.
Thank you, David.
Right into the microphones, please.
Can everyone hear me okay? Next to me is Ed Kean. He is recently retired from Quantitative Management Associates. It's a very long history in analysis. You've heard who the next speaker is. It's Bill Kennedy. He's the CEO of RiskBridge Management, an outsourced CIO firm, and he's also board member chair of the board of the GIC. And lastly, we have Matt McAleer, who's Executive Vice President of Director of Equity Securities at Cumberland Advisors. And I myself work at Cumberland Advisors, and I focus on fixed income credit analysis, most specifically into municipal bonds. Our panel is going to go from broad to narrow. Ed's going to speak about inflation and some other broad topics. Bill will talk more about risk and asset allocation decisions. And then Matt will finish up with more specific equity sectors, especially defense, healthcare, and energy, and all the things that may affect that. I think after each person speaks, just to keep it fresh, we'll try and get a question from the audience or myself. And then after that, we will have an open discussion, questions from the audience, and both for virtual and here. So thank you, Ed.
Patty, thanks so much. So thank you, David, for inviting me, and thank you to President Mester for her outstanding comments today. I told David that Wall Street is actually a surprisingly diverse place in many ways. There are Republicans and Democrats, there's cat people and dog people, so there's a variety of people in Wall Street, but every true Wall Streeter believes one thing in their heart of hearts, and that is that they would make a better chairman of the Federal Reserve than whoever actually holds the job at the time. So the criticism that David talked about is just kind of part of the job. So my comments on inflation will actually end with some issues about the Fed and whether the process that is going through is going to work out well or not. But I thought I'd just start by discussing how we got here and what contribution the war in Ukraine had to that. So about a year ago when the invasion happened, we saw an immediate spike up in a lot of commodity prices as we realized how much the world depended on energy from Russia and grains from Ukraine and so forth. But that now has mostly worked its way through. And although commodity prices are off their lows, they're back more or less to pre-invasion levels. But remember, inflation was already running very hot before that. So we had... and I think there's multiple reasons for that. And most of them related to the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we saw this huge shift in demand from services to goods. And if you look at a chart of goods demand over time, you see it's actually very steady for many years and then plunges in during the shutdown period and then soars. So from trough to peak, the demand for goods went up by about 50% in the course of a couple of months. And the supply side struggled to keep up with that, both when it comes to creating the goods and also getting them to people. A second big factor related to that was fiscal policy. The economist Larry Summers, who warned about excessive fiscal policy when others, including myself, were more complacent about it, has calculated that we spent about $3 in support of incomes for every dollar that was lost. So it's pretty clear. I think some researchers, at the San Francisco Fed, determined that approximately 3 percentage points of that kind of 9% we hit at the peak last year was a result of fiscal policy. And so it was really a combination of a huge and very short-term shift in demand. My colleagues at PGIM Fixed Incomes, or former colleagues, estimate that about 3% of inflation came from excessive demand for goods, and 3% came from shortage of supply. You throw in 3% of fiscal policy, that gets you to roughly the 9%. So where are we now, and where are we headed? So it's true, as President Mester said, that most of the measures of inflation are significantly off their peak, but they're still well above the Fed's 2% target. But I think what we've seen is that a lot of the things that drove inflation up have now reversed, in some cases quite dramatically. Used car prices that President Mester discussed are down quite sharply from their peak, but they're still well above where they were pre-pandemic. In the most recent inflation report, overall, it was slightly hotter than expected. But at the same time, if you looked underneath the data, some of those things, again, that had driven prices up have all fallen now quite sharply. So when we think about where we go from here, obviously Fed policy will matter a great deal, and the degree of slowing that they're willing to tolerate in order to get back to exactly 2%. But I think also part of the discussion has to be, how does inflation propagate? And I think for a long time now, central bankers generally have coalesced around the idea that inflation is about expectations. That is, that if you think that prices are going to continue to rise, you change your economic behavior. So if a price of something goes up, demand goes down, basic economics. The idea is that every once in a while, for a variety of reasons, people say, well, the price has gone up for a new washing machine by $100. But on the other hand, if I don't buy it now, it's going to be another $100 higher a year from now. So that distortion of economic behavior results in higher inflation, because instead of reacting normally to higher prices by reducing demand, it stays steady or even goes up. The trouble with that idea is, and this is not my comments, this is Jeremy Rudd, who's part of the Fed, is that it lacks a combination of a solid theoretical foundation and empirical support, which are two pretty important things to be the basis of global monetary policy. So what else? Well, the variety of things that can be suggested. One is that unit labor costs have been a very good, at least explanation, I'm not predictor of inflation. That's the price of labor adjusted for productivity growth. That's been a very good measure of inflation that's about to happen. But I also thought I'd briefly discuss an idea that I first talked about back in the late 1970s when I was at MIT, and that is, I think inflation is the process by which shocks to relative prices and relative incomes work themselves out. In that sense, it's almost a kind of social lubricant. It's part of the reason why the inflation target is 2% and not 0. The price stability is defined as having a little bit of inflation so that you can adjust to changes in relative prices. There's always some winners and some losers in the economy. We all hate to see our pay go down in nominal terms, but inflation allows it to adjust down slowly in real terms without having to necessarily take a pay cut. So when you have a shock to the system, there's winners and losers. So if you were in the used car business, you did very well in the early stages of the pandemic. If you owned a restaurant, at least initially, you did very badly. So those shocks, people try to get back to the status quo ante. And inflation is the process by which that happens. So if you say to yourself, we had this big shock that was driven by these factors that we talked about, huge shifts in supply and demand, the fact that the stuff that went up the most has now come down quite a bit. Airfares had shot up. It came down quite a bit in the most recent report we just got this week. So some of the things that shot up have already started to come back down. So as a result, I think that the process of adjusting to it or finding a new equilibrium is already well underway. And I think the surprise is going to continue to be over the next several months, as it really has been the last few months, that inflation will fall more rapidly than most forecasters think. So let me stop there.
Okay. So is there a burning question in the audience? Okay. So Ed, you talked about relative incomes. And why is that important and how do they matter?
Well, I think if you look at both in economics and the social sciences, there's plenty of evidence that we respond to our incomes relative to some reference group, not in kind of absolute terms. So you can think about this either across people now or over time. So you'll see people occasionally say that a kind of a middle-class person in the United States lives as well as or better than kings did a couple of hundred years ago. You have access to television and air conditioning and a bunch of other things that no one could have had back then. And yet I don't think that kings thought themselves being poor because they didn't have air conditioning. And also you see it across reference groups. So if you're an investment banker making $1 million, but the guy next to you is making $2 million, you're upset about, you think you're underpaid. In very poor parts of the world, the person who's better off in that poor part thinks of themselves as doing quite well, even though in absolute terms they're not doing very well at all. So there's a well-behaved structure of relative incomes. And that when there's a shock to that, people try to get back to where they were.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on now to Bill. You were going to talk more about risk and asset allocation.
Yes, so thank you. I'm going to share two observations with you. Number one, I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball, how we have thought about the war in Ukraine from an asset allocation standpoint. And the second observation is going to be a little bit counterintuitive in that war actually reduces market volatility. So let me go into a little bit of detail. And first, just from a background standpoint, RiskBridge is an independent, privately owned, outsourced chief investment office. We're based in Connecticut. We deal primarily with insurance companies, endowments and foundations, and family offices. And we're helping to provide consultation on asset allocation, the quantity of risk, the types of risks that are in the market. And then we also provide discretionary asset management for some of our clients as well. So as we think about the quantity and the types of risks that may exist, our asset allocation is really focused on trying to identify where we are on 3 cycles. So we measure a liquidity cycle, a business cycle, and a market cycle. So what do we mean by liquidity cycle? Here we're looking at generally financial conditions. What's the supply and demand of credit? What is the setting of monetary policy, not just in the United States, but around the world? And are we seeing liquidity flowing into the system or retreating from the system? And over the last 12 months, and in thinking about the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was very clear that we were beginning to see liquidity draining from the system. How much of that was tied to the war effort? Hard to say. But the facts and the data would support that Fed balance sheet was beginning to be reduced and that we were just at the beginning of the Fed rate hike cycle, which we heard a little bit from President Mester. In terms of the business cycle, we think that it's very difficult to understand how much of what we've experienced over the last 12 months has come from the uncertainty and the activity and the shocks of a war in Ukraine versus the uncertainty and the shocks of the war against a pandemic. We've been through unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy since 2020. And so it's very hard to tie the cause of these cycle shocks to one specific activity or one specific event. But what we noticed in probably around September of 2021, from a business cycle standpoint, all we're doing is we're measuring a very simple 2-factor model. What's growth doing? Is it accelerating or decelerating? What's inflation doing? Is it accelerating or decelerating? And it became very clear that we were seeing decelerating growth and accelerating inflation. Technically, I guess that's a stagflation environment where growth is slowing and inflation is picking up. And that continued all the way from September of 2021 until about July of last year. And that's when we started to see the rate of change in inflation slowing down. So from an asset allocation standpoint, in an environment where growth is slowing and inflation is picking up, that tends to favor things such as the commodity sector, both commodities individually, but also commodity-related equities. It tends to be a very bad environment for fixed income, and particularly treasury bonds or sovereign debt. And so we took that into account in terms of the asset allocation changes that we made. But as we came around to July of last year, when we started to see inflation rolling over, it's what we would determine to be a downturn regime. Doesn't mean we're heading into recession. It's just slowing economic growth and decelerating inflation. And that led us to consider a different mix shift in our asset allocation. For equities, defensive sectors tended to do better. Things like staples and utilities and healthcare sectors tended to perform pretty well through the third quarter and part of the fourth quarter of last year. And then thinking about the market cycle. When we're measuring the market cycle, what we're really looking at is the interdependency of stocks to bonds, or bonds to commodities, or commodities to alternatives, or alternatives to stocks. We look at all of those cross-asset correlations. And the one thing that we noticed beginning before the Ukraine invasion is that the correlations were beginning to go well off their historical path. It's a turbulent market environment. We've not seen a turbulence of that magnitude since 2008, since the global financial crisis. And so over the course of the past year, we have generally seen the liquidity cycle continue to suggest liquidity leaving the system. We've had the business cycle, which has gone through a regime shift. We went from that stagflationary type environment to a downturn environment. And in terms of the cross-asset correlation, we saw very wide dispersion from normal. And just that environment over that period led us to advise our clients to have a little bit less in risk assets, a little bit more cash or cash equivalents in their portfolio. Many of those signals have changed, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. So that's observation number one. What did we see in the last 12 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine? We saw a lot of turbulence and a lot of unparalleled activity in the liquidity cycle, the business cycle, and the market cycle. But we can't say it was because of the war. And so we did a little bit of research and studying as to what was causing this. Was it really a function of just monetary policy? Was it because of the invasion and the uncertainty that was created from the inflation shock? We found a piece of research that went back all the way to the early 1900s that showed in every war, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and Afghanistan, that you generally see about a 1/3 drop in volatility of equities. It didn't make sense to us. We thought, well, uncertainty because of war, lots of bad things are happening, mostly the loss of life, economic impact, the ramping up of the military industrial complex to fight those wars. Wouldn't all of that uncertainty create more volatility in the marketplace? But the empirical data suggests no, it doesn't. It actually, we have seen consistently a decline in volatility because of war. The authors of this paper would suggest there's two hypotheses behind this. Number one, every single one of those events happened away from U.S. shores. If you're sitting in Kyiv, your uncertainty is unlimited. Your volatility is unlimited. But if you're sitting in Sarasota, or you're sitting in New Canaan, Connecticut, or you're sitting in New York City, not so much. The other argument that they made is that part of the reason you would see equity volatility reduced is because of the government-sponsored, supported contracts, not just to military equipment, but other parts of the economy started to actually increase the certainty of earnings for those companies. And a good way to get volatility out of the system is just to have certainty of profit and certainty of corporate earnings. I know we have a panel, and my friend Byron's going to be talking a little bit about the defense industry. Would love to get his take on this, but those are the two observations I'd like to share. First, we've seen a very dramatic secular change in the cycles that RiskBridge analyzes over the last 12 months. But number two, we're not sure it can be tied directly to war. And there's this very unique characteristic about volatility in the equity market as it pertains to wars that the United States has participated in.
Thank you. Just a quick question. You referred to that paper that you got the historic information, but you also referred to a lot of other data and resources and research that you look at. Can you enlighten us and give us an idea of what some of those sources might be?
Sure. So we'll actually publish this. We'll post this paper. I should say it's already published. It was a piece that came out in March of 2022. There were three professors. The lead author was a professor from that lesser university up the road at Florida State University, who published this paper, and they set out the empirical evidence to show how equity volatility has fallen during each of the conflicts and wars that the United States have been in since the 1900s. What I'll do is I'll ask the GIC to publish that on their website, so that'll be available on the GIC blog. So if you go to interdependence.org, you'll see that on the blog, and you can access that paper from Dr. Cortez there.
Right. Thank you. All right, Matt, you want to take it away with more specifics, and then we'll on the equity markets?
Sure. And those were both nice broad overlooks, and I'll try to just give a little bit of color to some of our thinking at Cumberland. I would have to say we're probably the most transparent firm on the street. Many of you here that I recognize, and some of the people that I know are viewing, watch our weekly review videos every Friday. John Mousseau runs Fixed Income, and myself review where we're positioned, what we bought, what we sold, and why. So what I'm going to discuss may be repetitive to some people, but in terms of trying to give just a snapshot into how Cumberland positions capital in current times, I'll just spend a few minutes on that. The name of the conference is Ukraine 1 year later. I was on the panel a year ago. The markets were in much more flux from the Ukraine-Russia stance. Markets are flexible. Markets price in headline risk and physical war risk. So my comments today won't specifically be how we're positioned because of Russia and Ukraine. That's part of it, right? That's an unfortunate part of it and a tragic part of it. But what we're trying to concentrate on here, what I've been asked to do, is talk about markets and positioning. The first thing I'll say, and it's an overarching theme for myself, is that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has taken away the peace dividend in the broad equity markets. We've operated really for 30 years, and Afghanistan was a tragedy. But from an economic standpoint, it didn't impact the markets. Right, Scott? A tragedy, but not an economic impact. Russia, Ukraine has taken that peace dividend away. It has to be factored in at some level. And I think going forward, that has to factor in to how capital is invested, because it's never all by itself, right? 2 months later, China refusing to say that Russia was at fault started to create problems in terms of the markets with China. Many other problems, but perception is reality in the markets. Perception. So that peace dividend that we've enjoyed for 30 years, where you tried to follow the economy, you tried to follow earnings, you tried to follow growth, you tried to follow inflation, and working through that, throwing in headaches within bad business decisions in certain areas, going back to 07, 08. That was contained. That's bad business. That can be traded around. But once a peace dividend disappears, I just think you have to factor that in. Patty mentioned 3 sectors earlier. Let me start just a touch broader. Dating back to summer 21, and part of that was the inflation we were seeing, you did finally see value start to get its feet underneath it versus growth. This is summer 21. And again, we talk about this weekly. So we did start to adjust portfolios. Did we sell all our growth and buy all value? No. But we started to lighten up on growth and push that money over to value. We run both a core strategy, U.S. strategy, and a thematic strategy. The thematic strategy is more sector and industry related. The core strategy is getting the broad strokes right. So as we pushed to value, that was helpful. The Russia-Ukraine now we're just at 12 months, accelerated that push to value for us. So that was helpful in our core portfolio last year, that in terms of performance, and we get judged on performance, good or bad. So our core portfolio outperformed the S&P by about 750 basis points, or 7.5%. That, for us, is a solid year, much of it due to that shift to value. Let's talk more about sectors and industries. In our thematic strategy, David is day-to-day works on that strategy. Patty mentioned 3 areas that are overweight and have been overweight over the last 12, 18 months. Healthcare has a defensive value bent to it. Defense, and a couple words of defense will follow up some of the budgetary vision, how that will affect the defense company. But think about Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. That's a overweight position in which defense is probably 5% of the S&P. It's, with some of its growth, it's 15% of our thematic strategy. It's performed very well. That's helped buffer us a bit. Then third is energy. There was an energy conference here last week. If you speak about energy, you get extreme thoughts. I mentioned this last year when we were here for the Russia-Ukraine initial conference. You get extreme thoughts. Big energy is the devil. The only way we should be discussing energy is alternatives. I like to chop both that 10% off. Energy is good. If that should be our first thought. Where we go with that energy, how we make it as clean as possible, that's step number 2. So within our thematic strategy, we cover the broad energy area. So we own traditional energy in the form of energy baskets, the the larger baskets encompassing Exxon and Mobil and Chevron. We own solar. We own wind. We own water. Those four components of our energy area are close to now 20% of the portfolio. You take energy, defense, and healthcare, which I probably won't have too much time to get into, you're looking at close to 60% of our equity exposure. How about the other 40%? Well, we have some exposure in different areas, but in our thematic portfolio, we also have a 25% cash position. We heard Loretta Mester speaking. We know what's going on in terms of fixed income and rates. Why is that position as high as it is? Well, we're earning close to 4.5% on that money. That was something for the last decade plus was a pipe dream. If you were an active manager, which Cumberland is, whenever you held a cash position, you had to hope the market went down. Why? You weren't being paid on your cash. You're being paid 25 basis points. We needed the market to go down every time we got defensive. We're a fiduciary. We get defensive to protect clients' capital. When we get defensive, if the market didn't cooperate and go down, we were being penalized. That's changed. Now we can be somewhat defensive and get paid on that cash. I think that's going to be a theme you see going forward in the next 5 or 10 years. I think that may act as, I don't want to call it a drag on equities, but maybe a cap on equities. And by the way, I don't know that. The markets will decide that. And an intelligent, reasonable investor will stay flexible enough to understand that their opinion is just an opinion and the markets couldn't care less. Where people get in trouble, not to go off on a tangent, is thinking their opinion matters. The market's opinion matters. Our opinions have to be flexible and be able to shift as the market shifts. But the fact that we're able to earn that kind of return on cash is something we have to consider day to day. It gets a little bit to Bill talking about allocation, right? And Ed talking about inflation. We're in a different environment now. Part of it is certainly created by the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The other part is where we are in the inflation and interest rate cycle. So
Matt, a quick question for you. You focus on fundamentals, but you also focus on more relative value and momentum type measures. Can you just describe a little bit about how that fits into your looking at the markets?
Sure. Yeah. We do run multiple strategies. And one thing we have to always respect is the fact that we may be tilted value and find that that's where we want to position and target most of our capital. But if everyone else is thinking the same thing, that sector, that factor begins to get overbought and extended, and value can lose its proprietary term of value. And that shows up in overbought momentum readings and things of that nature. So within the portfolios, there'll be times where we're trimming what we like, but we're taking some off the table. Kind of a core approach where you'll trade around your core thought. So we do use some technical analysis, which sometimes can be called voodoo, but it really gets around to trying to understand where demand has gotten ahead of itself. And the flip side, we try to look at and we're again, it's about transparent as we can on those weekly notes and videos. We try to look where supply, where selling, where fear has gotten ahead of itself. And at that point, maybe even if we don't specifically like a sector or factor, we may be forced to push money into that area. Doesn't matter if we don't like it, because all the selling has created an opportunity that David hears me say, sometimes you have to close your eyes, hold your nose, and buy. Because there are so few sellers left in a short, specific period, right? So, always a balancing act.
Sure. Well, I do want to also say that we didn't do a long introduction on everyone's experience because it is included in the program and we didn't want to take too much time. So I just wanted to let you all know that. I know that you've alluded to some of your experiences, so I just wanted to make sure people knew where to get the full explanation. And I have a question for you regarding stimulus funds. You were talking about people are used to the money they were used to living with, and during the pandemic, they got a lot of excess funds. That's going away. States and local governments and all kinds of businesses got stimulus funds. A lot of that is still around. I don't know if it necessarily relates to the war in Ukraine, but in some respects, it does as our economy moves forward. And I know there's been a lot of juxtapositioning of companies back to the U.S. and things like that, which was affected by supply chain from both the pandemic and the Ukraine. So just the amount of massive funds that are still there sitting on a lot of sheets.
Yeah. So I think the fiscal pulse has mostly dissipated, but it's still there. So there's still a lot of money sitting in locality and states and local governments that was unspent from those stimulus funds. So there's still a bit of that left to work through, but that's mostly run its course at this point. So so that big boost in inflation we got from that kind of excessive stimulus, that's not totally gone, but it's mostly gone now.
Okay, good. I worry about that a lot, or I worry about it dissipating further because it has helped support municipal governments, which were pretty much prepared entering into the pandemic, and those reserves helped even more, and the stimulus helped. And
well, I mean, all of the programs that were really very helpful in that early stages of the pandemic, where the federal government came together and really helped a great deal. We went too far. So that's just, I think anybody looking at the data now would suggest that's the case. We just went too far.
We can't pull it back though. So, Bill, did you want to talk a little bit about what your indicators of liquidity, market analysis, what have you, mean for the next 12 months?
Yeah, so something changed in December, really November and December, where all of our indicators, the liquidity cycle, the business cycle, the market cycle, shifted after about a 16-month period of extreme risk aversion to moderate risk tolerance. We got a signal that it's okay to dip your toe back into the water. To Matt's point, we don't know why. We have an opinion, but nobody cares about our opinion. They just care that we make money. The signals that we're seeing is that liquidity actually started to come back into the market from China. We saw the Chinese government, the Chinese central bank, continue to increase the amount of liquidity they were putting into the market. That was a good thing. Secondly, we started to see some economic data on the business cycle, an indicator, starting to see economic data still decelerating, but coming in better than expected. That gave a positive flavor to some of the risk assets that we were looking at. And that cross-asset correlation all started to come back towards historical norms, right? We went from a turbulent environment to a quiet environment. So we're today, in February of 2023, our primary risk composite is neutral to slightly positive. which I hate because it goes directly against everything that we're looking at in the market. We still think there's a recession coming. We still think that inflation is uncertain. We know that there's a debt ceiling debate coming, and there's some uncertainty around that. But it suggests to us that having fixed income at or slightly above strategic target is a reasonable, rational decision, not the least of which, to Matt's point, you can earn 5% yield on a 6-month T-bill. And we've not seen that environment since 2007. From an equity standpoint, we believe that the earnings growth in the United States is going to continue to go lower, but the earnings growth in international markets, both emerging markets and developed markets, are starting to perform slightly better. So we see this trade-off between U.S. equity investing and international investing with an overweight towards the emerging markets equity perspective. And then the other area that we're focused on are what we call the diversifier space. What to do about commodities, what to do about energy, the energy transition theme. To Matt's point, we're not going to go from the fossil fuel driven economy of the world that we exist today to zero fossil fuels. There is roughly $100 to $150 trillion of investment to be had over the coming 30 years to help the world transition to multiple types of energy supplies. And we think that where there is a need for capital, but maybe a shortage of capital, returns tend to be slightly higher. And so we're spending a lot of time and effort. Our research team is focusing on investments in that particular area. Mm-hmm. So just to summarize all of that, we think that equities still have a bit of a challenge ahead of them. We're underweight U.S. equities, overweight on the international side. Within the fixed income space, cash is king. We like 5% guaranteed at the 6-month T-bill. And on the diversifier side, we think over the next investment cycle, over the next 5 to 7 to 10 years, there's enormous opportunity in energy transition and the AI movement as well, which we think is going to have a huge impact on the productivity of the manufacturing part of the economy in the United States. We think that's a pretty attractive opportunity long term.
So did the war in Ukraine kind of accelerated the knowledge that energy is important and that we have a transition to work with, as well as with all the defense stuff that's going on and the technology that's coming from that and the AI? I'm sure it's kind of almost accelerated some of the things.
So as the pandemic did as well. Yeah, so what the pandemic did for work from home, and we are concerned about commercial real estate and what's going to happen in that particular segment. But I do think, look, we've had 40 years of falling interest rates and decelerating inflation. Whether the combination of the pandemic, the war against COVID, and the war in Ukraine, which has created this new inflationary environment, is it a blip or is it sustainable? I was very interested to hear President Mester's comments because, to me, we have 3 scenarios. Our base case scenario is that we're going to be in a recession and have falling inflation. The best case scenario is we have a no landing. We don't go into a recession and inflation continues to decelerate. And the worst case scenario is we get stagflation. We have falling GDP growth and inflation stays at the 5%, 6% level. We only have a 10% probability on that stagflation scenario. I think that may be too low. As I've been having conversations like this over the course of the last few weeks, what we heard from President Mester, the chance of inflation being sustainably higher for a whole host of reasons, Ukraine being one, we have a huge amount of public debt that needs to be inflated away. I don't think the markets are positioned for 1% growth and 5% inflation. And that's the environment that we're studying to see, if we need to pivot or adjust our recommendations.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? They'll bring around the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I will bring the discussion back to the very macro level, but I'm curious to your thoughts about this. I'm looking at one chart, and that is the labor share of income and the profit share of income. The labor share of income, despite everything about the fact that wages are going up, et cetera, remains extraordinarily low. The profit share of income is, in fact, almost at an all-time high, close to 11%. So when you look at all the indicators, leading indicators, cyclical surveys, and so on, one would come to the conclusion that, yes, we should see a recession. However, with the profit share of income being that high, normally when you look at the possibility of a recession, that share really plummets. It's not happening. I don't know how to reconcile the two. And with that, what is likely to happen, Bill, in terms of your call on recession, your call on the defensive, or the value versus growth, would that change? And your observation about inflation coming down. Thank you.
So I'll start. Okay. So the shift in the share of income is at least a 40-year cycle. It used to be that there would be ups and downs of that, but really for about 40 years or so, it's been just straight down labor share of income. And then within the labor market, one of the things that has actually happened, if you look at the Atlanta's wage growth, the Atlanta Fed wage growth factor, is that there's been a pretty good shift of income towards lower income people. Their wages have actually gone up faster than inflation, whereas the higher income brackets have been more stagnant or even down in real terms. And I think there'll be a big test for the Fed coming up pretty soon. In that, remember, Chair Powell used to always talk about trying to help out people on the lower end of the income distribution, and then that kind of got thrown out the window during the pandemic. And you don't hear him talk about that much anymore because he's focused more on inflation. But at some point, if you're going to make that trip from 3% to 2%, and the cost is throwing a couple of million people out of work, especially those that are kind of in the lower end, is that really going to be something that we think makes good overall policy for the United States? I don't think so. I don't think the Fed is going to think that way either. So no one knows what the exact trade-off is. But I think if you heard President Mester's comments today, she was very clear that they're not going to change the 2% target. I think you hear from the Fed in the last several months is more concerned about the labor market specifically. And she said that we were running wages around 4.5%. In order to get down to their 2% target, assuming 1 to 1.5% productivity, you just do the math. It means you need to get down to, let's say, 3 to 3.5% wage growth, so about 1% lower than where we are now. But that will come at a cost. And at some point, I think you're going to have to say, as a society, is it worth that cost? Is it really that big? The 2% target, let's face it, is pretty arbitrary. It came from New Zealand through a legislative process. There's no econometric research that says 2% is the optimal inflation rate. There isn't. So, again, I appreciate her clarity and the fact that there was no wiggle room there at all. But I think at some point we're going to have to say, not just at the Fed, but as a society, what if there is an explicit trade-off there, how much are we willing to take in terms of not just the level of employment, but also the distribution of income?
Within that business cycle, there are 4 metrics that we monitor regularly: production, labor, consumption, and income. The production is declining and negative on a 6-month rate of change. So we're trying to narrow the window to get a bit more of a trend, short-term trend. So production is down, decelerating and negative. Jobs, labor is decelerating, not negative, but it's slowing even with last month's shockingly strong, good jobs number. Real consumption, so inflation-adjusted consumption, is decelerating and negative. Real wages are not. They're actually accelerating, positive and accelerating from where we are right now. So the risk to our base case scenario of falling growth, recession, and falling inflation is that those real wages turn into positive consumption, and the 70% of the economy that's driven by consumption, no landing, right? We just continue on. That's the risk to our base case scenario. So we're watching that carefully. And to Ed's point, I think the next 2 to 3 months of labor data are going to be very important to see if we've heard in the media all the headline news about the layoffs, particularly in the technology sector. Are those going to start to show their way into the jobs number and dampen the wage growth that we're seeing? TBD. But it's certainly a risk to our base case.
Just a quick note on the current snapshot of that chart. I think almost every economic chart, labor, income chart right now, has to be looked in the vein of what happened through COVID, through the absolute fire hose of money that came into this economy. Not that those charts don't mean anything anymore. I think they need more time to adjust. It's too close. We're only 2 years, a year and a half beyond that fire hose. And the charts are still trying to adjust as the economy is still trying to adjust. And our risk as portfolio managers at Cumberland right now is that growth equities continue to accelerate here, because we don't have enough exposure there if they do. That's not our bet. If they do, that's our risk.
So it's gone very quickly. We have time for one more question, and I believe there's one in the back there.
So there's a long-term structural change that's happened recently that I don't think has really been addressed so far. You know, over the last 30 years at least, we've had a big dividend in labor in the world, in productivity and the amount of labor, in the shift from the countryside, people in the countryside moving to cities in China and building a huge industrial operation. And I don't see much. I don't see too many areas in the world where that dividend is going to continue. There are a lot of cultural issues and an awful lot of political instability that I think are going to get in the way of that. If you look at Africa and South America and even other parts of Southeast Asia, I think that's more positive. But the other thing that's going on is demographics worldwide and in the United States. The populations are aging dramatically versus 40, 50 years ago, and people aren't having kids, which all implies to me a strong shift here, with labor being much more scarce and inflation having a much more upward bias. So I wonder if you could address that a little bit.
There's a pretty good book on this topic called The Great Demographic Reversal, which it's called The Great Demographic Reversal, I believe is the title. About a year, but that's right. And basically it goes through that exact thesis in some detail. I've forgotten the author, but I think you could probably Google it, find it easily enough. And I remember this vividly because I remember sitting at a conference where the late great Peter Bernstein actually outlined this idea. This is probably going 20 years ago. At the same time, if you look at the data, and they address this in the book, is that the aging of the population hasn't had the impact on inflation that you might have expected. In other words, this issue of labor being scarcer has been true in Japan for quite a while now. and yet it has not yet reflected, except for the pandemic, the big increases in inflation. So I would describe that argument as kind of still pending. And partially, I think it might be because the flip side of that is that you have more and more money finding its way into older hands. And I did a very detailed econometric study to surprise everybody to try to stay with me. What it comes down to is old folks are cheap. So it's hard to pry money out of these old hands. And so it may be that the offsets to the declining amount of labor relative to the overall population might be that on the spending side, is that older people tend to be more price sensitive than younger people are. So it's a very good argument and a very interesting argument. The book, I would highly recommend people reading it. But I think it's still pending. It's not crystal clear. As we said, that we've gone through so many shocks in the last few years. It's kind of hard to see how that affects the longer term trends.
I would just say Charles Goodhart was the author of that book. If you go to sorry for the shameless plug, if you go to the GIC website, we had an interview with Charles Goodhart just after that book was published, and it's still on the website. Highly encourage you to it takes about an hour, but he walks through the case for aging demographics as inflationary, which is contrary to some popular opinion that it's disinflationary. It's actually inflationary, partly because of the cost of healthcare and longevity and the like. But please take a look. Get the book, to Ed's point, but if you'd like to hear an interview with Dr. Goodhart, please go to the interdependence.org.
Before we let the panel go, I have a question for each panelist. For the audience, Ed is now retired, but I will include you in a number I'm about to say. You're looking at asset management close to $100 billion during their careers. If we include Ed, I don't know what the number grows to. I know his specific fund was 50. How do you decide buy, sell, hold? And that's what this panel was about. So I'm going to ask each panelist for a lightning round answer. All four. That includes Patty Healy, the moderator, who's gotten away with an easy ride so far. Her job is research on the creditworthiness of the $4 trillion municipal bond market of the United States. And I don't know what she does in her spare time. Here's my question. Lightning round. The single shock that would turn you extremely bullish or positive or favorable in your outlook. The single shock that would turn you very bearish, very negative, or harsh in your outlook. Who's a volunteer to go first? Patty Healy.
For municipalities.
Into the microphone so people can hear you.
So for municipalities, for people, for development, at least here in the United States, I think a more constructive regulatory framework for development, maybe less, we're having a hard time building projects, and we need some more infrastructure in this country. That would be a positive with less regulation. If we get more regulation, I think that will slow things down and people won't be as free to operate the way they would like to. So I'm about regulation and freedom.
Ed?
Well, this conference is about a year later in Ukraine. So if you said, what's the shock that would make it, would be a terrible turn in that war, especially the use of nuclear weapons. That would be, I think, the biggest foreseeable negative shock that I can think of. On the positive side, I hope my outlook on inflation is correct. If it is, and I think the markets partially already reflect this. That I think we won't need the Fed to get as tough as they are signaling they will be, and that could be good for risk assets in general.
we would be buyers and positive on capital markets if the S&P 500 were at 3,600 or below. That's about 10 to 12% below where we are right now. That's value in our view, and we think that we could become much more constructive. The negative shock would be if, for some reason, we saw U.S. headline CPI go back above 6.5%. That stagflation environment. We think that would set us up for an environment very similar to what we saw in 2022, double-digit negative returns on equities, double-digit negative returns for fixed income. That's a bad environment, by the way.
Negative shock, I would say, as Ed said, I don't know how well you prepare for that. You would think that the market starts to pick up on the nuclear scenario much quicker than it happening. The market always picks up on extraneous events. That would change. The biggest, I'm older school. I go back to the banks. Some real problem acceleration in loans would be enough to get me bearish. Positive. I think if inflation continues to tick down, you have to at least lean constructive. Again, we're defensively positioned. So if inflation ticks down quickly, we're in a little bit of trouble.
We're going to take a break in about 3 minutes. I have a little housekeeping. When we reconvene, the panel will focus on defense, the defense budget, and General Gray has agreed to join the panel with Byron and Bill and Lisa. So I'll introduce him now. He has a distinguished military career, and it includes some budget activity when you were in the Pentagon and activity like that. He was the commanding general of Andrews Air Force Base. He was responsible for Air Force One. I'll stop there with that. But sometimes he had to fly a vice president home for Thanksgiving dinner. There's somebody else in the audience that I saw, and she is the chief global economist of Ned Davis Research, Alejandra Grindel, who is also a GIC member and who is in the schedule for one of these future series. Alejandra, wave your hands, everybody sees you. So we'll take a 5-minute break, come back for the last panel on budget, defense, the economics of the defense. Let's take a break for 5 minutes and then come back and reset up the next panel. Thank you. Okay, this panel, which is going to address without restriction or reservation the issue of funding the defense of the United States. I will tell you, Lisa Shaw, who will moderate the panel, is the program chair of the Global Interdependence Center, and she is an investment professional of many years. General Gray, you've met. Byron Callan is the most insightful defense industry analyst I have ever met. I read his release from Cap Alpha in Washington on receipt. The email goes bing, I see it's from him, I read it. He's a huge wealth of information in great detail, as you will soon find out, about the defense budget and all the things in it. And he's also a very skilled student of history. And Bill Hoagland is with us, thanks to Byron's introduction. And his credentials, I don't want to go through all the credentials, we'll be here for an hour. But he understands the mechanism of the budget. Am I being polite, Byron, would you say?
Absolutely.
So we have a blockbuster session on defense, budget, its composition, what's missing, how does it fit in this context of worldwide financial sanctions payments war and shooting war? And how about the side that is part of our defense industry, but it's supplying other antagonists in this war? And what about the other side? We have an adversary. They're not sitting still and being silent. So we're in for a very exciting, stimulating hour. Lisa Shaw.
Thank you, David. I can't do more than that to introduce our panel, other than to say that it's a great honor for me to be the moderator today. We have previously decided that each of our panelists will give a few moments of their own thoughts and ideas, and then we will move to questions and answers. So, Bill, we will let you go first.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm honored and flattered to be part of this discussion about Ukraine 1 year later. I am not an expert, first of all, in the defense industry specifically, like Byron and the general, but I believe that we have to put the defense budget within the context of the overall federal budget. And literally, the slides that I'm going to run through very quickly here were updated first thing this morning because we had a major release here in Washington yesterday from my old organization that I began my career in Washington with, the Congressional Budget Office. And that Congressional Budget Office projections will serve as a basis upon which Congress may or may not make final decisions on spending for defense going forward. And so I'm going to put it in the broad context of the federal budget, and I will work down to defense. So the first slide I want to put up, I'll try to move them, but I don't know that I can move them. If somebody has the ability to do that, there we are. Good. This particular slide is simply updated from yesterday's report, and that is to look at the federal budget in terms of the context of its overall path going forward. The red line there is what is simply the annual deficit of the federal government, and I like to take pleasure in saying that back there where you see we had an actual surplus back in the years of 1998, 99, 2000, 2001 was one of the last major budgets I worked on. But you'll see that the path going forward was certainly not good after 9/11 in terms of a growing federal deficit. And then the blue line there is, the red line continues to what was the path of the deficit prior to COVID. And then the blue line indicates COVID and where we are today. And the unfortunate situation with that particular slide is yesterday's estimates show that even after COVID, we are still on a downward path of increasing federal deficits. Next slide, please. To put this into context in terms of the numbers, the federal deficit that we're dealing with right now for the fiscal year we're in right now, 2023, you'll see there if I had a pointer in 2023 is at about $1.4 trillion. And unfortunately, the projections going forward, if we put this big bird on automatic pilot, would show that over the next 10 years, we will still see a growing deficit as was witnessed in the previous slide to about 2.9 trillion. Now, that's the receipts are growing about 4%, but spending is growing faster. And what's the current debate that you all may have heard about and is the issue du jour, if you like, in Washington today, is down there called debt held by the public. If we add up all the deficits from the beginning of the Republic until today, offset by any surpluses, you end up with our federal debt. I'm not so naive as to say that at times we shouldn't be running deficits in times of war and recessions. That's natural. But I think what is most critical right now is the accumulation of that debt over time, is that we are now up into what really is most economists look at held by the public, not intergovernmental debt. We're at about 100% of GDP, and that is grows. And this is the unfortunate outcome of yesterday's dire report of nearly 118%, 120% in 2023. Next slide, please. And it simply is it simply shows that we are on a path here that we've not witnessed in our country's history, even going back to World War II. Even during COVID, we are on a very upward path as it relates to our debt and the issues associated. So in order to, of course, most of you, I think, are well aware that we have a statutory debt limit. We have hit that debt limit. The debate right now is whether or not how to increase that debt limit, and that will require, at the end of the day, 60 votes in the United States Senate to do that, and that's going to require, I think, at the end of the day, compromise. And quite frankly, though, you hear, well, we'll prioritize our payments. I don't think that's possible at all. And so we will have right now a rather difficult summer ahead. In fact, the CBO's report yesterday indicated that sometime between July and September, we will reach what we call here at CBO, at the bipartisan policy, the X date. And after that point, we default. And so this is going to be the issue that we're going to be dealing with throughout the summer and for spring and summer, to avoid the default. Next slide, please. And what the next slide indicates, that if we look at this in terms of the makeup of your total of your spending in the federal government, by the end of the decade here, we'll be spending about $10 trillion. I always tell people that you can pretty much impress your friends and neighbors by telling them you can put the whole darn federal budget on one hand. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, just paying net interest on the public debt, that debt that we've accumulated annually, and then defense. And note that defense spending in 2033 is even less as a percentage, as well as dollars, as it relates to just paying the interest on the money that we borrowed and the creation. So you can do away with that little blue box in the corner there with all domestic discretionary. You do away with the Department of Agriculture, do away with the Department of Commerce, do away with TSA, small business, EPA, the alphabet soup of agencies, and you will still have a major deficit in the year 2033, which means that we have to look at if debt matters, we're going to have to find some major compromises going forward. Finally, the next chart, please. The concern here is that portion of the federal budget, which defense spending is made, which is understood to be appropriated annually, has been on a downward path. And indeed, you can see as a share of our economy continues on a downward path in the year 2032 to around 2.6%, whereas non-defense discretionary is a slightly less. But the important point here is that both defense and non-defense make up only 30% of the budget. It's the rest of the budget that needs to be focused on, which is not being focused on by our elected officials today by taking major programs off of the table. I realize I'm speaking in Florida to a group in Florida, but I will have to say that taking Unfortunately, the politics of today are that Medicare and Social Security are off the table, but long term that cannot happen if we were to ever get our fiscal situation in order. So finally, two last slides. I simply point out, and then I'm getting into Byron's area and the general's area, that when I look at where increases in defense spending have occurred between particularly 21, 22, the majority of this has been in research and science last year, operation and maintenance, and then this broad category of other. I will simply defer to the experts to what all this means going forward. But next to the last slide I want to put up, please put up the next slide, is that the debate right now will be whether or not, in dealing with this statutory debt limit, whether or not we are going to continue to support funding for Ukraine. Of the nearly $50 billion that has already been provided in the various security packages for Ukraine over the last since early 21. The spend out, if you like, the impact upon the federal deficit has not been 50 billion, but more like about, as you see there, 18 billion. And this was updated from the Congressional Research Service at the end of January. The point being, it takes time to build up the reserves, the equipment, and get it over. But we have to replace that too. So this is going to be part of the debate in raising the statutory debt limit, whether there should be further restraints, should be any restraints placed upon the budget, given the geopolitics of the world. I doubt it, and I would imagine defense will continue to see increases going forward. And the funding for this, unfortunately, the original statement that I had was told this was going to be a discussion about how to pay for all this, is simply that I will have to say today that it will be very similar to previous wars, that we will have to borrow and have bonds to pay for, treasury bonds. We will have to continue to increase our deficit and debt going forward unless for some reason there's a consideration of paying for this through other forms besides borrowing. So the last slide is simply an old slide of showing where we were. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Lisa, to you and my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Bill. That is a fantastic slide. I am the granddaughter of Rose Riveter, so I'm seeing, in my mind's eye, the woman who built McDonnell Douglas aircraft. So thank you, Bill, very, very much. Our next speaker will be Byron, and he also has some slides to share. So we will let you have your time.
Good. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really honored to be on this panel, and thank you for organizing the conference. I'm going to take a slightly broader view and not just focus on the U.S. defense budget, but this is a global defense market. And a lot of the defense contractors that were mentioned earlier, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon Technologies, the bulk of their sales, typically 60-65%, are from the Department of Defense. But some of the more interesting things that are happening are in the global defense markets. And I really just want to talk about, because I think some of these points were touched on earlier today, what a change in kind of the global system this war has meant. Next slide, please. Just some obvious ones. This is the largest war in Europe that we've seen since 1938, 1945. It's really quite remarkable to me. We've engaged in proxy wars in the past with the Soviet Union, but really the scope and scale of the aid that's going to Ukraine in an area that's really kind of almost existential for Russia is different than I think what we saw a lot of times during the Cold War. European defense spending has been in a breakout mode. Seeing Sweden and Finland willing to join NATO is another pretty significant change in a global security environment. The Russia-Iran partnership is really intriguing, and seeing how that's going to develop over time. And there's some new elements of warfare, although I don't think some of these are necessarily new. They're just being used at scale and in different ways. The use of drones and certainly the ubiquitous nature of cell phones and all the imagery that people can post and generate about the conflict. So it is a pretty significant change, and I think really almost an inflection point in the global outlook for defense spending over the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. And this is just a reminder that we're coming up, this will be probably the fourth largest conventional war since World War II. We're coming up to the 1 year anniversary. We probably quibble about the length of days that I put up there for the North Vietnam, South Vietnam conflict. If you're over Hanoi in the late 1960s, it felt very much like a conventional war, but where you had two opposing forces that were fairly equally equipped. This one's different than a lot of what I think we've seen in our own recent lives. The Desert Storm conflict, Operation Iraqi Freedom. These were fairly short, violent, abrupt conflicts, and this one feels different now. We're coming up to a 1 year mark. I think we'll go easily into 2024 and maybe beyond that. That's one of the open questions about how long this conflict will last. Next slide. I think it's really moving into a battle of industrial bases. The two pictures on the left, one is a Russian tank plant. The lower left is an Iraqi drone factory. The right side is a HIMARS missile, and the lower right is probably unfair because the plants are much more mechanized than that, but it's 155 millimeter shell plant. The U.S. facilities are government owned. They're managed by private contractors. But this race that's going on now to supply Ukraine on one hand with weapons, initially there was a surge to kind of empty out the old Soviet stockpiles that were still held by a lot of European countries. We've now started to see an escalation into NATO standard ammunition, then excess or older NATO weapons, and now, really in the last couple of weeks, you're starting to see more sophisticated equipment, main battle tanks. I still think we're going to see combat aircraft at some point in the near future being passed on to Ukraine. On the Russian side, I think as much as maybe the panels later in this session or tomorrow will be talking about the economic and export controls have really been unprecedented in their scope and nature on Russia. It's imposed costs on their defense industrial base, but it certainly hasn't throttled it. And the amount of work that's done by Royal United Services Institute, for example, in piecing out how many weapon systems Russia is still using that have very high Western microelectronic content in them. These export controls are not shutting down the flow of technology into the Russian defense industry, or for that matter, Iran or North Korea. And I think if we peel back some of the Chinese kit, you're going to find the same thing for China. Next slide. There are a lot of known unknowns, and I think kind of to the earlier sessions about risk, there's still a lot of risk in this conflict. And I'll just walk through a couple. Moldova, we have trouble finding it on a map, but there have been some concerns about a coup this recent week or so in Moldova. That could be a flashpoint because that sits on the border of Ukraine and Romania. There's a small Russian force in Moldova. If something happens there, it potentially has a spillover impact to watch. The Black Sea Initiative that has allowed grain to flow from Ukraine is up for renewal in March. People I've talked to, I don't know if Russia's going to agree to that or try and change the terms, but back to this question about food inflation, what would that mean if we suddenly have a change in grain exports from Ukraine, which has been very important, particularly for the Middle East and North Africa as a source of grain. Nuclear weapons, I think the threats could continue. My personal view where I'm really going to get worried is if you actually start to see Russia test tactical nuclear weapons. That might be a very strong signal that they in fact would think about using these. The rhetoric would continue, but the threats would, maybe back to David's earlier question about what would really change your view as a risk. A test would get me very excited. Zapad 23, these are Russian military exercises. They're done in the West. Zapad is the West. They're coming up for one of these in September, October this year. I've heard concern that at that point they may have enough mobilized forces to present a credible threat to some of the Baltic states. So keep an eye on that. That just because we see Ukraine conflict, there is a risk still of some escalatory behavior in the rest of Europe. China's behavior, the links that we're seeing develop with Russia, or maybe a deepening of some of those links, particularly supply of material, microelectronics, I think are important. And we can talk about some of those in Q&A, some of the other points I've raised in that list. Next slide. Defense budgets. So I took this data from IHS James. There are not a lot of good sources on global defense spending projections, although James does do this. I pulled out China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia from this data. But you can see, and this is data in real terms, it's about 1.5 trillion up to 1.7, 1.8 trillion. The U.S., I think, as Bill just showed, is probably around an $800 billion part of that. James shows this kind of leveling out around 1% to 2% growth through the end of this decade. I frankly think it's going to move higher. You're already seeing indications that it's going to be moving higher. There's a major security conference this weekend in Munich. You'll probably see a commitment to move European defense spending higher than the 2% of GDP goals that have been talked about. The FY24 budget will be dropped in early March. DoD leadership is already talking about increases in that request. Next slide. This may be a little difficult to read, but I wanted to look just briefly at global defense stock performance since the war started. And I think it's interesting because it may, markets aren't always correct, but I just looked at the pure play defense stocks and how they performed over this time period. Most of these stocks had outperformed their home markets. In the United States, for example, I think the S&P 500 is probably down around 18% or so since the war started. The defense stocks have done okay. Europe, you've really seen some stunning moves in stocks like Rheinmetall or Saab, Hensoldt, that are German or Swedish defense plays that are participants in this surge in European defense spending. And then the interesting ones are countries like South Korea and India, who you wouldn't necessarily think of as beneficiaries of the Ukraine conflict. But South Korea has actually concluded some fairly major deals with Poland and other Nordic states to provide armored vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and tanks. And India had been highly reliant and still is reliant on Russia as an arms supplier. They've made a decision to try and source more of their own defense kit locally. And so that's, I think, why you've seen the Indian stocks play as well as they've had. Next slide. I just want to run through these very quickly. As Bill talked about this, these are slides that go back to 1940. When I think about the federal debt and what the risk is to defense spending, how we're going to pay for it, for me, it's really going to be the interest on the debt. And I just put this slide because I think some of the period that Bill talked about, we've clearly been at levels where net interest outlays have been much higher percent of GDP. This is actually OMB data, not CBO data. I didn't have a chance to update my charts, but next slide. I think when I think about defense and how we're going to pay for it, it's this interest rate question, and probably that obviously gets tied into inflation, not necessarily the debt and deficits themselves. And just a final thought, as I think, as you're all aware, the Russia-Ukraine war is not just about defense spending; it's about a range of macro factors. I think this is going to go on for a while, and I think there's still a lot of risk to think through as you think about your own businesses, your portfolios in the months and year to come.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. So far, in my mind, we already have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask Major Gray if he'll make a few comments.
Yeah, I retired from the Air Force in 2009. From 2007 to 2009, I worked for the Secretary of the Air Force, did acquisition. I oversaw $19 billion worth of Air Force money. I was in charge of buying big airplanes, okay? The new Air Force One, the new tanker, the new trainer that's under development right now, the new gunship, and oversaw all maintenance, logistics, supply contracts for the same. So the defense budget implications, okay, that's what I'm going to talk about, is implications, if you would. As was so correctly shown, percentage of GDP being spent on defense has gone down, while the acquisition costs of weapon systems has gone up. So that's a natural conflict, to say the least. When I was commander of Andrews Air Force Base, 03 to 05, all right, we were going to accept delivery of the new Air Force One platform, 747, all right, which is still not delivered. It was going to be delivered sometime around 14, all right? When a SAF AQQ, when it's my problem, I got to go brief Congress that was going to slip to 18, okay? They're now saying somewhere between 22 and 24 before it's delivered, okay? That is not abnormal for weapon systems procurement because their acquisition process, the oversight with Congress, the decisions that have to be made about where you're going to allocate money, where you're not going to allocate money. All right. So when you take a look at where the defense budget and the way it's formulated, you've got your four major services, okay, and five if you include the Coast Guard now, and you also got your Space Force. So it's a continuing food fight because everybody develops their budget in a stovepipe. And then it goes up to the Joint Staff DOD. They work on what they call a your 5-year defense plan. And that goes forward to Congress where you try and get your programs funded and everything. It's a very laborious process. Think about the implications of the war in Iraq. And it's a 43-day war, I believe is what we're showing there, okay? We went in and with thunder and lightning, we were able to decimate the Iranian forces, okay? What we did is we showed the way that our technology could be worked, our communication skills, our command and control and everything, and the intelligence, and then the total decimation that we could bring to a point battlefield, all right? That's a very small conflict. Our forces at one time were built for Cold War, the Falcon Gap, the Fulda Gap over in Germany, okay? Force on force, tank on tank, man on man, if you would. We now have the abilities to project power in such a way that I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of those stalemates in the future. And I'm going to use the Ukrainian thing. It shows very much that force on force, everything with emerging technologies. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. The cell phones we learned last year. The cell phones were being used by the Russian command and control folks to move their forces around. The Ukrainians owned those cell phone towers that they were using, okay? Unintended consequence. Made sense when you let the contract, made sense when you bought the system, didn't make sense in warfare. So they lost an awful lot of their top generals and colonels because of a lack of intelligence protection due to that cell phone stuff. We've seen drones used in a massive amount in this war that we haven't seen before. What is AI going to do to the next ones? So what are these emerging technologies going to do? And as you're building your defense plan in your stovepipe, what technologies are you looking at bringing? What forms of warfare? What lethality are you looking at? Go back to Pearl Harbor, all right? The main targets there, all right, was not our battleships, it was our carriers, which thank God have to be out to sea. The carriers proved a new technology that brought the end of the war to the Pacific, all right? What's the new technology that we're going to be looking at downstream? In the Pentagon, there's a concept out there called 4+1. There are four enemies, all right? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all right? And the +1 is terrorism. We haven't had a terrorism attack in this country in a long time. But if one comes, what is that going to do to our current thinking? Under George W. Bush as president, he took money from the defense budget and stood up Homeland Defense. All right, so there's always a trade-off on things. So as we go through these processes, we plan, we budget just like a household would, for your best case scenario, what you think the right scenario is going to be for the future, and then change happens. And when that happens, you react. Where I'm going with this is the implications of this planning process, all right, that it's very, very regimented and it's very, very good and that kind of stuff. But as you've had the shrinking GDP, rising cost of acquisition, as you're going through Congress getting the approval to buy these weapon systems and everything, there's long-term perturbations, long-term effects of that. We did a tanker competition in 2007, and we selected a tanker. It's just now being fielded. It's got problems, okay? We fielded the F-22, and I'm talking Air Force specific. We fielded the F-22, and we're going to buy 811 of them. The Obama administration came in and cut that to 181. All right, well, there's a 700 airplane gap that the Air Force wasn't planning on, all right? So we're buying more F-35s. F-35s have been delivered. They've got some problems, software problems, that kind of stuff. What you find out is that on your weapon systems, I don't care if it's Army, Navy, what, it doesn't matter. The technology is evolving so fast that you're continually modifying old weapon systems, all right? And all this plays into, how do you build your defense budgets for downstream? How do you sell Congress on what you think is truly the right answer? And then, if a budget's not approved, how do you use a continuing resolution? How do you adapt to that? The lack of a budget, if you will, for your planning and your execution. So these are some of the problems that go on inside the Pentagon after the budget has been passed or as the budget is being built up.
Thank you very much, Major Frank. Now is our time for questions, but while you all are thinking of yours, a simple question in my mind is, who has the more advanced military today? Is it us or them? And I'm just saying them.
Depends where you sit. Generally, yes, the U.S. still has superiority across the board, but China has developed an array of capabilities. They've been watching about how we fought our wars really since Desert Storm, since 1990, and they've learned. And they have some very potent and very capable systems. There's a current DoD official, very senior, who used to say, the U.S. is the global military power everywhere in the world except 1,000 kilometers along China's coastline. So, and maybe to the point about how quickly some of these changes are emerging in technology, drones, I think, are going to be a real problem, a real issue. You had an army that has been used to operating with complete air superiority, our army, but I think a lot of European armies too. And when armored vehicles, the thinnest armor is on the top of the vehicle. And to put a $5,000 or $10,000 drone on top of an armored vehicle, it's a pretty bad way of doing business. But so I would still give us, number one, but we've got a lot of challengers. And I think if you were looking at some discrete areas, there are some very serious problems that we have to think through.
Thank you. Bill, did you want to comment on that question?
No,
Okay, I didn't think it was in your quiver, but Major Gray?
Yeah, so in my opinion, opinions are like belly buttons, we all have one. In my opinion, we're still the most advanced military out there, okay? But that's eroding, all right? You take a look at what's going on in the press. You just had an Air Force 4-star, General Minahan, say, folks, 2024, we're going to Russia with China, get ready today, all right? Was he clear to say that, or did he say that? I don't know. That'll fall out one way or the other here soon. You've got a Navy admiral saying, I need weapons, all right? You've got our Space Force commander saying, take a look, China now has more ICBM launchers than we have. Take a look what's going on in the South China Sea, where China is building islands, okay? Well, those islands all have airstrips, so they all have missile defense systems around them and everything, and communications capability. If they can project their power better than we can, we're in trouble. And we're going to talk, as I said earlier today, the last day, April 21st, I think it is, we're going to talk about the tyranny of distance. When you take a look at where China is situated, the most oil-rich area down there is the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands and everything. They're going to claim it. Well, they already are. The Philippines are claiming it. Malaysia is claiming it. Everybody is. Vietnam wants it. But China is going to have the projection capabilities to overrun that very rapidly. How do we react? How do we react if China moves in on Taiwan, which is in their backyard, sort of like Cuba to Florida, if you would? All right, this is a major problem, and I don't have the answers. Maybe you do, sir. What China is spending on their military as a percentage of their GDP versus what we are. But ours is now down below 3%, and it's not going to get any better anytime soon. So today I would say yes, it's us. Not so sure about the future.
Thank you, General. Dr. Eisenberg.
Oh, this is a question for Mr. Hoagland. You had a chart fairly early on in your presentation that talked about public debt held by the public. It turns out that from an accounting perspective, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet counts as debt held by the public, which is now over $8 trillion. If you subtract that from your numbers, do you get a different conclusion about anything with regards to the debt?
No, I don't get any different conclusion from, even if you were to subtract that and go back and subtract it. What it does show is that we've had a major increase in our debt level over the last many years. And so, no, it doesn't change my position on this at all. And I would, while we're on this subject matter, just let me point out that of that debt held by the public, the one that most economists worry about, not the intergovernmental debt between Social Security and Medicare and the trust funds, has been, and recently about 30% of that debt is held not by Americans, but by foreign investors. And what I worry about in terms of national security is what happens when those foreign, we are, quote, we like to say, the best looking horse in the glue factory. What happens when that we lose some of that edge and those investments go other places? We end up with, well, you're going to have additional increases in interest rates and going forward. So I'm a little filibustering the question, I guess, but I will say that I want to re-emphasize what was said earlier from Byron, and that the real concern is the fastest growing component of the federal budget is not defense, it's not Medicare, it's not Social Security, it's simply paying the interest on this public debt.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. I have another question in the back.
Somewhat of a statement and I guess a question to our panel. Sir, thank you, Mr. Hoagland. Thank you very much for your statistics on the federal budget. And they really set the stage for a poor lunch. In this discussion we're having is an interesting discussion, but it strikes me as a hollow discussion. And I'm not criticizing anybody, but I don't know how we can talk about more defense spending or other than this than without recognizing the large elephant or whatever metaphors in the room. And that is, we're broke as a nation. I mean, we're broke. And I watched our dear Senator Scott's, I guess, what's his name, Scott, who said that the other day. And, he told the truth. Federal proposed sunsetting federal programs every 5 years. Probably a wise idea, but a very unwise idea politically, one of the worst political mistakes I've ever seen anybody make, and he's going to probably suffer for it. But to get to the point, as you said, sir, none of this can be changed unless we attack Social Security, Medicaid, and entitlements, and I'm one who's on two of those. Are we in a position from a foreign policy perspective, from a national security perspective, where America has to recognize that it can no longer be what it was? That we must decline as a power of the world, not unlike Britain after World War II when they withdrew east of Suez. That's really the question, in my opinion. Not whether we can borrow more money to spend on defense, not whether we can defend Taiwan. I want to defend Taiwan. The question becomes, how much money do we borrow to defend Taiwan? How much money do we borrow to continue to pay my Medicare and my Social Security? That's the question. It's a larger philosophical, geopolitical question that no politician has really stood up and said, because they can never get reelected, no, we are not going to be the greatest nation in the world from now on. We can't afford it. Opinion?
I'll go for it.
I have no opinion. I'm the moderator.
Well, Bill, I think CBO. One of their little paragraphs talked about you could eliminate. We'd still have $1 trillion deficit.
Right,
I think by
right.
2033 if we eliminate every program except the mandatory program. So going after the discretionary spending and just keying on what Bill was talking about is not the way you're going to get at this problem. And I see it personally in the defense sector. There's a lot of stuff in the non-defense discretionary program that contributes to national security, the NASA budget. There are apprentice program support. Now, maybe that could be at a state level. That's a whole other debate to have, but it's not just as simple as there's a security part of the budget and a non-security part of the budget. Britain could make decisions like East of Suez and become a declining power because we backed them up. If we don't do it, I don't know who backs us up at this point. And then do you want to live in a world where China or other countries like China are going to be making those calls? And I think you're right. It's a fundamental debate. I look at, opinion polls all the time. The economy is the number one concern that most Americans have. But I also think personally, this balloon crisis that showed up initially, it's like, well, why are people so excited? This has been going on for a while. I just think it's a very, very different visceral experience when Straits of Taiwan, that's somewhere distant, but if it's over your head, it has a very different impact. So I'm intrigued on how that might change the debate too.
General?
I totally agree with you. I think that's question zero. Who are we, where do we want to be, and how do we get there? Okay. 31 is probably higher than that now, $1 trillion in debt. That's a big number. That's a trillion with a T, all right? How do we service that debt? How do we pay for it? Because every time we make that payment, we're not buying something over here. All right, do you bankrupt on it? I think we learned today you don't default, not bankrupt. You don't want to default on that, all right? You've got to go out and pay that kind of stuff. Are we going to continue to be the nation that whenever there's a natural disaster anywhere in the world, it's our planes and our ships that show up with humanitarian supplies, all right? You saw the massive devastation done in Turkey and Syria. We're over there right now. How many nations came to our aid when Ian hit down here? Right? We like to get out. We like to help folks. That's what we are as a nation that does that. Never once in any war have we taken so much as 1 inch of land from another country. All right? That's not who we as Americans are. We like to go help. We service everybody's problems. We take care of everybody's problems. Do we want to continue to do that? The problem in the future. Do we need the massive ICBM force we have? Well, China's building theirs and Russia hadn't gotten rid of theirs. Do we need space? Do we need NASA launching as much as they are right now? These are major, major questions. And sir, I compliment you because that is exactly the discussion that needs to be being had in Congress and everywhere else in this nation.
Can I just, Lisa, could I just respond? First of all, I wish I was there with all of you. I apologize that I can't be in Florida with you today. I have another, in fact, I have another presentation I have to give on the deficit here in a few minutes. But I'm a farm boy from Indiana. I still want to remain optimistic. I still think this is a great country. I still think that democracy does work. I guess to the answer of the gentleman who asked the question, there's an alternative to borrowing, and it's not. And I worked, in fairness, I worked for Republicans. I was a staffer in the United States Senate and worked for Republicans in all my years up there. And so this is hard to say. But if we're not willing to pay for all these services and defense that we have out there, then you do borrow. Brian can correct me, or the general can correct me. It's my recollection that during the Korean War, we paid for that by taxing the American public. At some point, we have to belly up to the bar, so to speak. If we want all these services, if we don't want to reduce Medicare, we don't want to reduce Social Security, we don't want to modify our defense, we want to increase our defense, we're going to have to start paying for it as opposed to putting this burden on a future generation. So there's an alternative borrowing. It's not popular and certainly politically going nowhere in this Congress right now, but we're going to have to sometime face up to the need for additional revenue somehow, unless we're going to cut back on some of these services that we provide to the American public.
Thank you. Kathleen.
Thank you. So this is a question for Bill Hoagland. So over the past 20 years, the wars that America has been involved in have changed dramatically. Different types of wars. And that presumably has put pressure on the defense industry. So my question is, what has been the multiplier effect on the economy for seeing the shifts that we've seen in the types of war that has been conducted? Thank you.
Well, very good question, but probably I'm not the best one to answer that. Probably Byron is, or the general is. But I think you touched upon something that I really think is important, is that this spending in after all, we could say the internet came about because of defense spending, and there are spin-offs here. The benefits of technology and investment and growth has a benefit to the non-defense sector, if you like. But I don't have an answer to your question. I would just simply say investments in science and technology, research and development in defense does have a multiplier effect in the private sector. And I don't have a metric to answer exactly how much, but I believe that's true. Byron, I think you should answer this question.
I don't have the exact multiplier effect. I do know, there has been a very significant shift in R&D spending in general, where it was in the 1950s and 60s, primarily government driven. Now, the defense industry is really drawing off the commercial sector for a lot of technology that's being incorporated into these systems. I do think we are, last 20 years, war on terror, the stuff in the Middle East, these were counterinsurgency campaigns. The kind of wars you're looking at now are industrial scale. And so I think it is going to be interesting to see how this plays through into manufacturing again, into China is a whole other subject, but the reshoring of raw materials, critical raw materials, semiconductor manufacturing, all these things back to the United States. So I get back to this inflection point, and you're seeing a change, a big change in how we look at it as a country.
Matt, thank you.
Matt McAleer. This would be a question that any of the three gentlemen can answer and may have differing opinions. In terms of some of our allies and predominantly Europe's pledge post-Ukraine, Russia, post the invasion, to increase the percent of defense spending or GDP. Number one, do you think that will be sticky if the war starts to fade, right? And that may not be for 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not putting a number on it, but will that be sticky? And if it is, does that take some pressure off our budget, getting some of that additional help from allies, financially, and like General said, even physically? Where is some of that other help around the world when a tragedy happens or an invasion happens?
I think, the answer to that question is partly going to be, what do you think Russia's going to look like in 2025, 2027, 2029? I mean, it's still a country with 140, 150 million people. It's probably one of the most resource-rich land masses in the world. I don't think the attitudes that Vladimir Putin has embodied are necessarily going to turn on a dime, and we're going to see Russia embrace Western democracy, Western-style society. So, yes, the burden-sharing debate has been going on as long as I can remember in my career. I do think the frontline states, Poland, Finland, Sweden to an extent, Romania maybe, although they're much smaller, the Baltics, although they're tiny, they're talking about generational defense increases. Japan, is going to double their defense budget over the next 5 years, and they're not doing that because they think that this is a flash in the pan in Ukraine. It may also key back into the earlier comment about how reliable will the United States be? Will the United States really be able to do all this stuff? Can we be the firemen that we were in all these global crises? So I do think some of this is sticky. Yes, it could reduce some of the burden over the longer term. Frankly, U.S. industry is benefiting from some of this change. If you look at the exports of F-35s, of HIMARS systems, and so I think we're still going to be engaged in this, but I don't see that as a downside necessarily for U.S. industry.
This is a great question for tomorrow to ask General Breedlove. I think he's really up to speed on NATO and that kind of stuff. My observation of this, Matt, would be our military-industrial complex, not just in this nation but worldwide, has shrank. All right, so you can give bags and bags of money to whatever country, and they can only produce what they can produce. All right, so are you going to have to take those bags of money and buy more capability to produce? It's probably a starting point. You've seen a major contraction of our military-industrial complex over the years. You now got Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman. Those are your big five. Back in World War II, we had 20 or 30 of them. All right, and we continue to neck down. Same things happen in Germany. Same things happen in France. On and on. So it's a great question, but tying it to your GDP and increasing your GDP is the first step. Now, what do you do with it from there?
That's it. We are out of time. Do you want to take one? Do we?
He's had his hand up the whole time.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Well,
please, sir.
Well,
ask the question.
Just relative to the affordability issue, and it is an issue. Robert Kagan has a book out just recently. It's called Ghost at the Feast. And he analyzes essentially the first half of the 20th century. He makes a very good point that one of the primary causes of World War I and World War II was the absence of leadership from the greatest industrial power in the world, which is the United States, and the inevitability of getting drug into it. So I think when we look at, and he makes his argument, he's not a conservative Republican. I think he's from the Brookings Institution. When we look at affordability, I think we have to look at the consequences of what happens if deterrence fails. Mm-hmm. And the consequences are catastrophic, not just for losses in life, but in costs and the economic impact. So that needs to be put into the equation. I think he does a very good job of that in that book.
Great point.
Okay. Yes, sir. We have one more question. Oh, thank you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Please tell everybody who you are.
Yes, my name is Giti Javidi. I'm a cybersecurity professor here at USF. I have a question related to Iran. And I'm sorry, I had to write down my question because I have to explain some things before I actually go to my question. While Iranians protest in the streets and children as young as 10 years old are being executed, the regime has armed Russia with drones for its war on Ukraine while using the same weapons against its own people. Iran seems to be involved in every chaos, creating international chaos. They seem to be providing weapons to other countries while strengthening their relationship with China and Russia. And my question is, what do you think some strategic, diplomatic, and realistic policies towards Iran should the United States consider?
That is a very good question. Diplomacy.
Well, I think
panel 1 hour to answer that question about it.
I think obviously, the day-to-day sanctions, export controls, I mentioned the flow of microelectronics to Russia, pull apart the Iranian drones, you're finding the same. So it's building up those control regimes and actually enforcing some of the things that are on the books. And that's not just a U.S. problem, that's a global problem. I don't know, India, the rest of the Middle East, obviously Israel as an alliance partner, the relationships in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia are going to be important. And I think just giving a voice to the Iranian opposition to the extent, that there may be an alternative to a regime that has really, I think, skating on thin ice, but they've been skating on thin ice for a long time. So I don't have a good, simple answer to it, but I do know, the more that their industry benefits from this war, and they are benefiting from it, they have people learning how to operate drones in a contested environment against NATO air defense systems. That's very useful information. So I think we just need to be very keen on doing some of the lessons that they could learn as well too.
Bill has a comment on that.
Yeah.
Bill, do you have
No.
notes? Okay, great.
Well, I tried to deflect. It didn't work. It is a phenomenal question with a lot of insight and a lot of concerns in there. There's nobody in the world that wants to see a nuclear capable Iran. Nobody in the Middle East wants to see that. All right. And to see them talking, remember I said you're 4+1, and Iran was one of those 4, and so is Russia. Iran is now supplying drones and weaponry to Russia, right? They're talking. China is talking with Russia. China is talking with Iran. So here's our big 4, and they're all communicating at this time, and it's all showing up on the Ukrainian battlefield. So is this going to lead, to a world war? Is it going to lead to bigger escalations? Is it going to lead to a regime change? Impossible to tell right now. But cyber is at the heart of it all. There is absolutely no doubt about it. We talked about that in depth last year at this conference, how cybersecurity is just a major player. And to see the Iranian regime exporting what they are while fighting off their internal battles is very interesting. They're at a tipping point in their own country. It's going to be interesting to see where they go. Nobody wants to see a nuclear capable Iran, and we need to make sure, do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, and especially David.
Well, let me housekeep before we thank the panel and thank Bill for spending an hour with us. Very kind of you. We're sorry you're not here to enjoy lunch, but next time we see each other, I owe you lunch. Just a little housekeeping. The next session of this 7-part series is tomorrow. And we have designed all of them to be mornings only, little lunch. And that's why this process is extended. On March 9th, there's an all virtual session. And it will include how artificial intelligence is used in military operations. And it will include some folks from the Joint Services Operations University. I may say that backward. I always get it backwards, but Joint Operation, yes. That's going to be a fascinating session. It will all be virtual. On March 23rd and March 24th, there will be both in-person and virtual. Registrations for those are available on the USF website and the Global Interdependence Center website. And on April 20th and 21st will be the last 2 sessions. Every one of those sessions has either sitting or former central bankers, including conversations with Alfonso Pratgay, who was the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina, and as finance minister, renegotiated the largest debt default in history. That's an example of a speaker. There will be a session on central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. That session is at the request of Karen Holbrook, who said last summer we should talk about this. That session will also include how the bad guys pay each other. That's a very big issue. And we have a very special guest in that session, Christopher Waller. It'll be the first time in the history of this university that a sitting governor of the Federal Reserve will be at this podium in person for his remarks. In the middle, we have a sitting member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England in March, Catherine Mann. She will be virtual. Others will be in person. This is a blended meeting. So tell anybody who would be of interest. This is fully sponsored. It's open to the world, to the public. And anybody who wants to be an ambassador for the university and for the Global Interdependence Center and for the Air Force Association to spread the word of this conference. This panel has been wonderful. I hope you enjoyed the day. We have completed day one. We have some sandwiches and some lunch in this salubrious gathering. That's because it's healthy. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bill.